Good evening, friend. Settle in and dim the lights. Tonight, we'll begin in the quietest corridors of Roman history places, not filled with emperors or gladiators. Instead, we go back several months before Mount Vesuvius silenced the city, back when it still buzzed with ordinary life. And among the vendors and tavern owners, politicians and potters, walked a man whose name we'll never know. His job, to carry other people's words, but with sandals worn down by dust, ink fading on wax tablets, and the soft rustle of papyrus folded into a satchel. We begin in Pompeii, but not on the day it perished. That part of history is well told. He knew who tipped with a coin, and who offered only a nod. And while he did not hold power, he held something far subtler. He knew what people were saying. Roman society respected orators and architects, but not messengers. A woman scribbling something nervously, sealing it with wax, and hurrying away. He would have passed temples and shrines, especially the little ones, dedicated to Lares, the household gods. He may have stopped at one each morning, as was custom, tapping the stone with a hand for luck. And yet, without men like him, the invisible wires of the city's communication would fall slack. In many ways, he was a thread holding together households, partnerships, long-distance friendships, and debts. Did he flee with a pouch of unread tablets still slung over his shoulder? Or did he die in the shadow of a message never delivered? He was a letter carrier to Belarius, in the Latin tongue. One such letter, found on a tablet near the house of Lucius Caecilius Jucundus, reads simply, "Do not forget the amphorae from the harbor. My brother returns soon." In a culture where oral tradition remained strong, writing was both a luxury and a tool, but it was fragile, too prone to erasure by fire, rain, or, in this case, ash. It is likely our postman carried messages, just like that mundane, brief, filled with errands or mild gossip. He likely never imagined it could interrupt his route, much less erase it entirely. Yet, those errands formed the arteries of city life. Commerce flowed through these wax tablets, the low murmur of a postman reading addresses by memory. He carried messages, but he also carried routines, trust, and continuity. You might imagine Roman communication as swift and grand, full of scrolls and chariots. You can imagine him tying his tunic with a thin belt, slinging the leather satchel over his shoulder, and perhaps taking a crust of bread or a fig with him. His walk would take him past the city's painted walls, frescoes of gods and geese, election notices scrawled in red ochre. Sometimes he'd be asked to wait for a response, standing for hours in the corner of a peristyle garden, as a master dictated a reply onto a fresh tablet. But for everyday folk, especially in a provincial town like Pompeii, mail didn't travel with imperial dispatch. Most likely, he worked as a freedman, once enslaved, now hired by wealthier patrons to carry documents or accounts. His pouch might contain a wax tablet with a merchant's list of debts, or a simple letter from a mother to her son. He didn't read them, but he knew, as he passed through Pompeii's narrow stone streets, how to carry these private words with care. There were no mailboxes, no state-funded delivery routes for civilians. If you wanted to send a message to a friend in Herculaneum, or to a cousin posted in the legions of Germania, you handed it to someone you trusted often, someone like our postman. He was not an official. He was not even a full-time employee. His day likely began early, before the streets grew hot. He knew the back doors of Pompeii, the shortcut past the baths, the alley near the amphitheater where fishmongers shouted insults in Greek. There were letters that survived Vesuvius' wrath, singed, but readable. His role was thankless. He would have seen strange things on his route. A politician slipping money to a tavern keeper for silence. The volcano, of course, loomed in the distance. But to him, it was just another mountain. Pompeii was a tightly knit city. The postman might have visited the same homes day after day, growing old alongside his recipients. If you listen closely to the silence of Pompeii's ruins, you might almost hear the slap of sandals on stone. Yet we know nothing of his name. What happened to this man on that final day? Was he in the city delivering letters when Vesuvius struck? If you returned to the streets of Pompeii in the months before the eruption, you would not find drama at every corner. You would find predictability, bakers kneading dough before sunrise, merchants setting out their goods, and somewhere in the background, our anonymous postman beginning his daily route. He wasn't important in the eyes of history, but he was necessary in the mechanics of everyday Roman life. And that's where the story lives in. The quiet work that made a city function. There is something strangely dignified about the life of a Roman courier. He wasn't a soldier, but he walked great distances. Some might have even been enslaved people needing to communicate with others, discreetly organizing purchases, relaying orders, arranging meetings. Our postman didn't ask questions, or if he did, he asked them with silence. A good messenger, after all, knew what not to know. He wasn't a priest, but he entered more homes than most. Many people could recognize their names or numbers, but writing full letters, that was for the educated. So some messages our courier carried may have been dictated by one person, copied by a scribe, and then handed off. This chain of communication was fragile, and yet it persisted. Was there someone waiting for him when he returned home in the evening? Satchel empty, sandals loosened, hands still smelling of old parchment. We don't know. The archaeological record gives us no answer. And in the sky above the mountain, strange clouds were forming that did not belong. But to someone like our postman, the practicalities of life still loomed larger than omens. The city had survived tremors before. And what use was superstition when there were letters to deliver? Perhaps he lived alone, in a small insula above a workshop. Did he have a tablet in his bag that was meant to be delivered to a family across town? One that never made it? Did he knock on a door that no one answered and feel that cold moment of uncertainty? Perhaps he shared quarters with others like him, freedmen with no grand legacy, but a stable rhythm of life. Perhaps he even dreamed of saving enough to open a little taberna of his own someday. He wasn't a scholar, but he witnessed how knowledge moved. His route takes him past the forum, where men are already shouting over stalls of olives and salted fish. There, at a corner, he pauses near a fountain. He dips a piece of cloth in the water, wipes dust from his brow, and continues. Maybe a tip now and then a hunk of cheese, a sip of watered wine, but mostly, he walked for stability. He walked because that's what freedmen often did, labored invisibly to hold together the ambitions of others. His sandals are worn smooth from years of use, and he tightens them with a slow, habitual motion. He lifts his satchel, now carrying 3 wax tablets and a rolled papyrus scroll, sealed with green wax. It's addressed to a banker in Herculaneum, which means he'll need to pass through the gates and down the Via della Bendanza, cross into the countryside, and follow the coastal road. The morning light hitting the cracked tiles, the sound of fountains splashing in courtyards, and the smell of oil and bread wafting from open windows. And through all this, a man was walking, quiet, unnoticed, but every step keeps life flowing. And in Pompeii, where every fresco seems to tell a myth, it's easy to forget the men who simply moved things from point A to point B, silently, repeatedly, and without His satchel was likely simple, coarse leather, creased from use, the inside lined with bits of cloth or parchment for padding, a nod, a handoff, perhaps a few murmured words if the message is urgent. But most of the time, it's quiet, wax tablets, which were the everyday notepads of the ancient world, scratched easily. They were framed in wood, sometimes in pairs or trios. Important letters might have been sealed with a blob of wax and marked with a signet ring. That the letter hadn't been tampered with. He wouldn't have dared break such seals. It was not only illegal, it was unthinkable. The trust of his patrons, no matter how low status he was the currency he lived by. But how did he remember his roots, or which house belonged to which? Merchant or matron, Pompeii's streets weren't numbered. There were no formal addresses. The postman would have memorized the city in patterns. The door with the red mosaic lion led to the Diar's villa. The house with the fig tree out front belonged to the widow who sold perfumes. He learned the city not through maps, but through repetition, through footsteps, through time. There's something peaceful in imagining it, isn't there? His clients would have ranged from noble families to traders. It's easy to forget that literacy in the Roman Empire was far from universal. He likely earned little, perhaps a few asses a day, or more if he was carrying something urgent. Let's pause for a moment and picture one specific morning. The postman wakes just before dawn, rubbing sleep from his eyes as the first hints of light touch the domed roofs of the back. As he steps outside, he passes a neighbor feeding chickens and nods. Wordless, each stop is predictable. A brief knock, a servant answers. You might be wondering, did he have family? And then sometime later, not yet, but soon the signs began. Dogs barking restlessly at night. The ground was giving off strange tremors. The well waters turning cloudy. Still, you wonder, on that final day, did someone send him out with one last message? And did he understand what was coming when the ground shook harder, when the sky darkened, when ash began to fall like rain? The morning of August 24th, 79 CE, began like so many others in Pampa, still, humid, and unremarkable. Birds sang from rooftops. Merchants shouted half-heartedly about fresh figs, and somewhere, our postman likely tied the leather strap of his satchel with the same practiced nodus. Oh, Vesuvius, to him, had always been part of the background, large, unmoving, just another piece of the horizon. In fact, 17 years earlier, a major quake had damaged the city's infrastructure, and repairs had been slow. Cracks still marred some buildings. Scaffolding still clung to temples. Life had moved on anyway. And in the distance, rising over Vesuvius, a dark, vertical plume began to rise straight up, as if drawn by the hand of a god, mushrooming out at the top. He wasn't a scholar or a priest. He didn't interpret signs. But maybe, just maybe, he noticed the birds flying lower. Maybe he coughed once at breakfast and chalked it up to a passing chill. After all, the post had to be delivered. It's hard to say what he felt that day. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps a vague unease. The earliest tremors struck around mid. Not a surprise. Pompeii had always shivered now and then. One was found near the Stabian baths, curled as if still trying to breathe through the heat. He may have turned toward the noise, the rising cries, unsure whether to press forward or return home. Perhaps he glanced at the sealed wax tablet in his hand and debated whether it still mattered. But this was different. That in the panic, he turned around, fled, dropped the tablet, or fell with it still strapped to his back. A man who spent his life delivering messages dies with one in his hand. A letter frozen in time, not burned, not torn, but preserved by the very disaster that ended everything. The inscription has mostly faded, but it is believed to be a personal note, something about a request for grain or a household loan. He reminds us that history is not just the sweep of great men and their wars, only a faint impression, a possibility, a guess. It's also about the people who held things together, quietly, the scribes, the cooks, the cleaners, and the messengers. Isn't that how most of us live, carrying messages, performing our duties, unnoticed by the world at large? He wasn't special, but his life mattered because he made other people's lives run just a little smoother. The seal was never broken. People began pouring into the streets confused, shouting. Dust billowed from rooftops as tiles shook loose. Somewhere, a cart overturned. Still, not everyone ran. Romans were pragmatic. For his footsteps on ancient stones. For the letter he never got to deliver. When excavations began in the 18th century, much of the attention went to statues, frescoes, and villas. But the real story of the city, its rhythms, its quiet routines, emerged in the minor details. A loaf of bread still in an oven, a dog chained at a door, a bowl of olives on a table. They waited. You can feel the weight of the satchel, the dryness of the wax tablets, and the heat rising from the stones under his sandals. You can imagine the exhaustion at the end of a day, the satisfaction of a route completed, and the silent pride in a job done well even if no one ever applauded. White at first, then gray. Roofs collapsed under its weight. Fires broke out. Ash swirled thick in the air, choking breath. And yet, Amid this panic, we know that some Pompeians stayed behind, perhaps to guard their homes, or because they believed the worst had passed. They watched. The postman may have been near the forum, or perhaps closer to the city gate, ready to cross toward her. Eyewitness accounts, like the letters of Pliny the Younger, tell us what came next. By afternoon, pumice began falling from the sky. Maybe our postman stayed to help someone, or maybe he made for the northern gate, tablets still tucked under his arm. Some of the bodies discovered centuries later show signs of motion, people caught in mid-stride, their arms shielding their faces. Among them are men clutching sacks or tools. We'll never know for sure, but perhaps one such skeleton preserved by the merciless ash was once a man who walked Pompeii streets day after day with a satchel and a purpose. What's haunting is what was left behind. At the house of the tragic poet, archaeologists uncovered a wax tablet, still sealed. It's entirely possible that this message was in our postman's satchel that morning, that he never made it to the villa. There's a kind of poetry in that, isn't there? Pompeii would be buried for nearly 1,700 years, forgotten, left under layers of ash and pumice. And in those details, you can almost sense the life of our postman. In many ways, he is more real than emperors or generals. He left no monument, no quote, no heirloom, and yet, doesn't that feel familiar? He was a thread in the fabric of a city, and when that thread was burned away, the entire tapestry eventually unraveled. So tonight, as you rest, think of the postman of Pompeii not for his name, but for his purpose, and ask yourself, how many untold histories lie buried not in ash, but in forgetfulness, waiting for someone to remember the lives lived in silence? Let's drift back even further in time. Now some 4,000 years ago, to the city of Ebla, nestled in what is now northern Syria. Before Rome, before Athens, before Babylon dominated the world, Ebla quietly thrived in the 3rd millennium BCE. It was a city not known for its conquests or cathedrals, but for its paperwork. A man who sat on a low stool for hours each day, stylus in hand, gently carving cuneiform script into soft clay tablets. They were written in Sumerian and Eblate, a now extinct Semitic language. These weren't myths or poems. They were inventories, trade records, diplomatic letters, supply lists, and tax accounts. He was not famous. In fact, his name is long lost, if it was ever written down at all. But he was essential not because of who he was, but because of what he recorded. The room would have been cool and quiet, lit by narrow slits in the walls, or by flickering oil lamps. A low desk made of wood or stone sat before him. At his side, a basket of clay tablets, slightly damp, waiting to be inscribed. Yes, paperwork. In the faint hissing of stylus against clay, in the knowledge that he wasn't wielding a sword but preserving the order of things. Perhaps he was offered bread by a younger apprentice, flat, barely risen, coarse and crumbly. He chewed without enthusiasm. Perhaps he glanced at the palace courtyard, where guards chatted lazily. But then, he returned to his work. Each wedge-shaped impression had to be precise, forming the characters of a script that few could read, and even fewer could write fluently. Slowly, carefully, every head of cattle tracked meant another priest could perform a ritual. Bureaucracy, boring as it may sound, was how empires were built and how they survived drought, famine, and war. One wedge at a time. Tonight, we meet not a king or a warrior, but a scribe. Ebla was a place of administration. Its palace complex, unearthed by archaeologists in the 1970s, yielded more than 15,000 clay tablets, many of them still legible. On occasion, when court officials gathered to make decisions, he was summoned not to speak, but to listen and record. His words would not be his own, but they would outlast every speaker in the room. When the city was sacked around 20 to 50 BC, possibly by the Akkadians, its palace was burned to the ground. But that fire, paradoxically, baked the clay tablets, hardening them like ceramics and locking in the information for millennia. And the knowledge that if you pressed hard, the tablet would crack. If you pressed too softly, it wouldn't hold the shape. Or did he flee, clutching a bundle of notes, seeking refuge in some lesser known outpost. Did his children carry on his craft, or did his work vanish with the walls he once served? They were trained intensely, memorizing lists of words and symbols, repeating them over and over on practice tablets. Mistakes were common at first, but tolerated only briefly. One wrong symbol could alter the meaning of a shipment or a debt record. We study the lives of goat herders and grain inspectors and city accountants, not because their lives were dramatic, but because someone this dull, nameless man chose to record them carefully. It could collapse a transaction, or worse, dishonor a god. Pressed into clay, dried by fire, and retrieved by patient archaeologists. One contains an alliance between Ibla and another powerful city-state, laying out the exact terms of tribute, rites of passage, and obligations in case of conflict. But this document was filed next to a list of oxen, and behind it, an inventory of temple rags. It was the kind of work only someone like our dull scribe could love. You can imagine his day. He'd entered the scribe's chamber shortly after sunrise, the heat of the day not yet pressing against the stone walls. A logistical organism fed by sheep, goats, grain, textiles, metals, and tribute. Its bureaucracy was massive, and the scribes were its gears. Our dull scribe sat for hours each day, turning these gears by documenting the movement of livestock, the appointment of officials, and the contents of caravan shipment. His stylus was likely a reed cut to a fine point. It wasn't for drawing, it was for pressing. And so he began. 5 shagoats were transferred from the southern pens to the temple of Kura, delivered by Bazi. That was a real entry. Not very poetic, but full of information if you know how to read it. You see, Ibla was not just a city, it was a machine. Did he enjoy his work? We'll never know. But it's easy to imagine that he found comfort in a repetition. He might have paused once or twice a day to stretch his back. 60 units of barley stored in silo 6, lost due to spoilage. 12 units, mold confirmed by a... His records were not romantic, but they kept the city running. Every jar of grain documented meant a meal prepared. There is a kind of reverence, isn't there, in the quiet mind of someone who knows they'll never be remembered but still works as though the future depends on their accuracy. Because, in a way it did, some of the Ibla tablets mention entire geopolitical treaties. To the scribe, all records were sacred. Whether treaty or torn tunic, he likely trained from childhood. Scribes were not casual laborers. Imagine the pressure. The city expected perfection, but there were no typewriters, no delete keys, only clay. Still, he pressed on, day after day. He may have worked alone sometimes. Other times, he likely dictated to apprentices, or copiette from master scrolls. And so he wrote. It's worth noting that many tablets found at Ibla were preserved not by intention, but by destruction. In this way, our scribe's words survive, not because he was honored, but because his office was accidentally kilned into history. And now, thousands of years later, we read his accounts in hushed museums and scholarly papers. But what became of him? Did he die when Ibla fell? Was he killed? His hand still ink-stained, and his last tablet incomplete? We don't know, but we are left with his words. Thousands of them, which leads to a deeper question. If your life's work wasn't exciting, but it helped preserve the world's memory, wouldn't that be enough? Imagine sitting in a room with no windows, the air heavy with oil lamps, smoke, and damp clay. The floor is stone, cool, even in the midday heat. Around you, shelves are stacked, not with books, but with tablets, thousands of them, some fresh and soft, others hardened by time. You're seated cross-legged, your posture familiar to the body through years of repetition, your fingers dusted with flecks of drying mud. This was the world of the Ibla scribe. While we tend to picture scribes as literate elites, in Bronze Age heavy, they were more like civil service machines, trained in utility, not poetry. Our scribe didn't compose stories or carve heroic inscriptions. He created records. He measured weight and time and labor and loss. His job wasn't to make history, And there was so very much to count. Ebla's prosperity during the mid-3rd millennium BCE was tied to its position along crucial trade routes. Caravans moved in and out of its gates, carrying goods from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant. Tin, wool, spices, and textiles changed hands at Ebla's market squares. But behind the scenes, in quiet chambers, like the one where our scribe worked, every jar, bolt, and goat was accounted for. Clay tablets from the period include titles such as Inventory of Wool, dispersed to the weaving workshops. According to tablets found in the so-called Palace Archive Room, Palace administrators tracked not just raw materials, but people. How many laborers worked per day? How many were ill who received double rations for exceptional work? And who was punished for negligence? And the mental agility to switch between tasks. Royal correspondence, ration logs, legal codes, and temple records. In a single day, he might alternate between documenting the dowry of a noblewoman and tallying losses from a shipment spoiled by rot, ration lists for palace workers, month of rain. Perhaps he developed calluses in strange places on his fingertips, from gripping the stylus, or at the base of his spine from sitting on stone. Perhaps he sat across from a steward reciting details of an incident. Laborer Jesu failed to appear for 3 consecutive days. If he had won, it must have been quiet and unceremonious. He may have lived in a modest room within the palace complex, eating with other officials. His meals were likely regulated measured grain, beer, lentils, and sometimes meat if supplies were strong. No luxuries, but enough. The kings ruled, the traders profited, and the priests prayed. But the scribe, he remembered, claimed illness. No evidence of fever. Rations reduced. He didn't question it. He recorded it and moved on. Fire swept through the archive rooms, consuming shelves, beams, and walls. Panic must have reigned. Guards shouted. Servants ran. Clay tablets cracked underfoot. The tablets rarely mentioned the personal lives of scribes, unless it was in the context of inheritance or crime. We don't even know what he looked like, tall or short, stooped or square. Nothing remains, not even a sketch in a margin. Or did he? Seeing that it was over, sit at his post one last time and record something final? No final note was found. Was it a list of donkeys, a shipment of wool, or something stranger, an omen, a letter, a warning? But perhaps he didn't think in such lofty terms. Perhaps he simply liked the order of it all, the predictability, the satisfaction of completing a list, the comfort of a world that before its sudden fall made sense through numbers. No farewell etched in fire. Records of donkeys allocated for diplomats, certainly. The way he used margins, spacing, and symbols to create clarity and repetition. That nothing he had counted on would ever be the same again. Some tablets have edits, crossouts, corrections, and insertions. He was not careless. He simply wanted to get it right. But in their dryness lies the heartbeat of an empire. Table of duties. Table of stuff dry. Let's take the weaving workshops, for example. They weren't a side business. They were a central pillar of Ebla's economy. Textiles produced in Ebla reached as far as Elam and Egypt. Our scribe may have spent weeks simply documenting fabric rolls, the linen count, the color, and the number of looms assigned to each laborer. Perhaps he knew which weaver preferred working with blue dye. Perhaps he remembered which workshop delivered consistently underweight rolls. These are not the kind of insights that make it into epics, but they are the kinds of truths that hold cities together. The bureaucracy was vast. Our scribe may have been responsible for recording these disciplinary notes, and while we call him dull, his role demanded precision, stamina. It's a quiet sort of brilliance to hold so much boring detail, and yet never lose focus. Still, the work must have worn him down. Maybe his back ached constantly. Maybe his eyesight, worn from years of squinting at fine clay etchings, began to fade. And what of his private life? He may have been married, or not, and yet, strangely, we can know his mind. The layout of his documents tells us much. How he organized data, how he grouped related records, there's a kind of sad beauty in that. His entire intellectual life was dedicated to keeping someone else's world in order. And then one day it all collapsed. The palace was burned in a violent invasion, likely by the armies of Sargon of Akkad, or his grandson Naram Sin, was described there when the flames came. Did he try to save anything? We'll never know. But what we do have are the accidentally fired remains of his life. S-work tablets hardened in the blaze, their dull words made immortal, not by glory, but by disaster. It's tempting to romanticize him, to imagine that he took pride in knowing he was a cog in a great machine, and so the story pauses here, just before the fire. What was the last tablet he worked on? Was there ever a moment, as the smoke crept beneath the door, when he looked up from his work and realized, let's return now to those final moments, not of the man necessarily, but of the system he lived within. The archaeological evidence shows intense destruction: shard beams, toppled walls, shattered vessels, and, crucially, the collapse of the palace archives. It wasn't just a military loss, it was an administrative apocalypse. The fall of Ebla was not slow, it was swift and fiery. Whispers in the palace about approaching armies, missives from the outer towns, mentioning caravan raids, supply records are growing thinner, fewer barley deliveries, temple rations reduced. The numbers weren't adding up, and the patterns he'd come to depend on began to fray. Our scribe may have felt the tremors first, both literal and figurative. He may have tried to keep writing, keep counting, even as panic crept into the margins. Perhaps he recorded a line like people always know, even if they don't say it. There are signs, a shift in tone during meetings. More guards near the doors, fewer visitors from neighboring cities. And worst of all, less paper, less to write about, less to organize. Rations for oxen deferred, reserves low, northern trade routes silent. By the time of the Roman Empire, even its name was forgotten. They had no idea what they'd find. Some were broken, others had warped slightly from the heat, but thousands could still be read. The language Eblet had never been fully deciphered, but once cracked, it revealed a stunning truth. This wasn't a minor outpost. This was Ebla, once a major player in the Bronze Age world, that had documented gifts between cities down to the last silver ring, that had counted everything. And because they counted, they remembered Dan, because they remembered we can. The desert wind blew over its ruins for nearly 4,000 years. The palace walls became hills. The archives became dust beneath dust. Simple, dry. But underneath, others, perhaps including our scribe, may have stayed until the last possible moment dutiful. Not brave. A nameless scribe, long dead, now resurrected through the wedge-shaped grooves he left in clay, bound not by honor or glory, but by habit. So much was never written down, so many names lost, so many lives erased. Around him quiet, steady, and unseen, the beating heart of a civilization. But the scribes of Ebla, dual and methodical, gave us a rare miracle: administrative immortality. Does it mean your story was never worth telling? In the days before the fall, scribes across the palace must have known. What does a bureaucrat do when there is no more system to maintain? Not because of kings, not because of priests, but because someone like our scribe took the time to write down exactly how many cows were sent to the northern pens during the month of rain. But thousands were, by a twist of fate, preserved. The fire baked them into permanence, accidentally fossilizing an entire city's soul. Some would have fled, some would have been killed. All of it is dull. All of it is deeply human. And then the fire came. It swept through the palace, feeding on wood, oil, fabric, and whatever else the invaders left behind. Tablets were knocked from shelves. Some shattered, some melted. Our scribe's work lived on. Centuries passed. Kingdoms rose and fell. Languages changed. The memory of Ebla vanished. And then, in the 1960s, a team of Italian archaeologists began digging at a site called Telmo. By 1975, they struck something astonishing. A buried chamber filled with cuneiform tablets, stacked in neat rows, many still in place just as they had been left. It took years to translate them, and the man responsible for recording its pulse. His words about sheep and beer and temple staff told us what kind of people the Eblets were, that they worshipped a god named Kara, that they taxed wool but not fish. It's easy to forget that most of ancient history is silent. It's a legacy not built of heroism, but of Think of this. We know more about daily life in Bronze Age Ebla than we do about entire centuries in other parts of the ancient world. There's a strange serenity in that, because in the end, our lives are also recorded not by statues or speeches, but by receipts, calendars, forms, and ledgers. The scribe of Ebla, in his silent devotion to bureaucracy, gave us something rare, a window into a vanished world before history became legend. And so, tonight, as you drift further into rest, let this final image settle in your thoughts. A man in a robe, seated on a low stone stool, a clay tablet is in front of him, a stylus in his hand. And the last question that echoes like a whisper carved into clay. If no one ever reads the words you leave behind as you settle deeper into rest, let's follow the soft murmur of the Nile slipping past reeds, past crocodile eyes, just breaking the water's surface, past the calls of herons waiting near the banks. This is not the Egypt of pyramids or pharaohs, not the Egypt of gold and tombs and declarations carved in stone. This is the Egypt of laundry. Tonight, we trace the life of a man you've likely never heard of. An ancient Egyptian. He lived not in palaces, but in mud-brick dwellings shaded by palm leaves. His job was simple in description, but complex in execution. He washed other people's clothing. In the tomb of Rekhmire, a powerful vizier of the 18th dynasty, there is a detailed mural showing workers in all kinds of roles. Metalworkers, brewers and yes men kneeling beside basins, beating linen with sticks and twisting fabric to dry. And in a world where linen was sacred and water both abundant and harsh, his daily grind reveals a side of history rarely spoken. We know about washermen because the Egyptians, meticulous record keepers that they were, wrote about almost everything, even laundry. His father may have scrubbed linens for a noble estate, and now Mena did the same. His day began early before. The sun grew hot when the Nile still held the chill of night. Conversations would have ranged from market gossip to temple politics to the rising cost of barley. The priest's skirts must be ritually unblemished. Every now and then, an overseer might approach, unrolling a papyrus list of clients and their assigned quotas. That was their world. Let's imagine one of them. We'll call him Mana. Common name in New Kingdom Egypt. Mana was likely born into the job. His name might have been etched once into a ledger kept in a temple storeroom, now lost. But without him, without the washerman, the pageantry of Egypt would have looked far less divine. He walked barefoot to the water's edge, where large, shallow stone basins had been carved into the banks, sometimes artificially leveled to create space for workers like him. A stain on a sacred garment could cause a priest to reject an offering, or worse, call for punishment of the washerman who had defiled the fabric. Mena knew this. He washed those particular linens, apart from all others, using extra nitron, extra prayer, and sometimes his own breath to dry them more carefully. Temples ordered every scrap of ritual cloth scrubbed and dried within a day. Mena and the others worked until dusk, sometimes by torchlight, their arms aching and their stomachs hollow from skipped meals. He knew when to move the cloth, when to flip it, when to fold it loosely, so it wouldn't wrinkle into hard creases. If lucky, they might earn a copper ring. But mostly, their wealth lay in routine. There was comfort in knowing what to expect. His walls were bare, his possessions are few. A reed mat for sleeping, a clay pot for cooking, a place to sleep. We know more about Egyptian embalmers than we do about those who washed the fabric for the dead to be wrapped in. We know more about the gods' robes than the hands that cleaned them. Water nearby. Or did he find peace in the steady flow of water, the rhythmic slap of linen, the warm weight of sun-dried cloth folded clean? Its priests would have looked ragged. Its kings would have wrapped themselves in unwashed shrouds and work. Even if thankless, a tiny statue of Tawaret, the goddess of protection, was tucked beside the door. Men awoke, washed, dried, ate, and slept. The cycle was stable, predictable, and for the working class in ancient Egypt, predictability was a kind of survival. Maybe the act of making something pure again was enough. He could tell when linen was just dry enough by touch, never to stiff, never to damp. With a woven basket slung over his back, Mena carried the day's load: tunics, loincloths, and even temple garments that had to be kept ritually pure. Before all of that, a man like Mena had to scrub that fabric until it shone, and so he began. Birds sometimes landed on him. Dust blew in, and if even one corner was dragged into the mud, the whole load had to be removed. The Egyptians used a trana, naturally occurring blend of sodium carbonate and baking soda, a slurry made from ash and oil. It cleaned, yes, but it also wore down the fibers over time. Mena's hands were likely always raw, his nails rimmed with grit, and his joints sore from twisting and slapping cloth against the stones. Washing was not gentle. Soap, as we know it, did not exist. Imagine it now. The sound of water sloshing, cloth snapping against rock, low murmurs between workers, and the occasional curse as a finger scraped too hard against a stone. This wasn't solitary work. The laundry banks were communal. Mena worked alongside other men, sometimes boys learning the trade. 3 linen skirts for the priests, wise by sunset. 2 from the North Dockmaster's house. Don't mix the That was the worst part, not the physical labor, but the expectation of perfection, especially for temple linens. In Egyptian religion, purity was paramount. Gods did not tolerate filth, not even imagined filth, and yet his life was invisible. He was not honored with stelae or buried in painted tombs. He left behind no odes or offerings. Think of every painted priest in white linen, every noble reclining in spotless robes, and every mummified king wrapped in fine gauze. The process of drying was no less demanding. Washed clothes were spread over lines or laid flat on red mats near the river. Mena watched the sky, constantly gauging the angle of the sun, the speed of the wind, and the threat of clouds. Some days were uneventful, others brutal. During festivals, laundry increased tenfold. Households demanded their best robes, cleaned in time for processions. They were paid in bread, beer, and the occasional scrap of leftover cloth. He lived near the edge of the city, perhaps Thebes or Memphis, where the streets thinned and the houses leaned into one another. But he had what mattered. What's strange is how little history records his presence. It makes you wonder, did Mena ever resent the silence around his name? Did he dream of something more? Maybe he never asked for more. But one thing is certain, without the washermen of Egypt, the empire would not have gleamed. Their labor, invisible though it was, made Egypt shine. And so, before we close this first section, ask yourself, how many civilizations have depended, quietly and entirely, on the unseen hands of those who kept them clean? The Nile moved as it always hadn't, bothered by dynasties, unfazed by politics. And beside its eternal flow, Mena worked. His daily route was almost ritualistic. Up before dawn, before even the roosters found their voice, he would pack his woven basket with the day's assignments: rolled tunics, temple robes folded carefully in cloth wraps. Other days began with dry winds, hot even before the sun crested the eastern horizon. It might seem a stretch, but cleanliness in Egypt wasn't just physical, it was moral, spiritual, even cosmic. Linen was associated with purity. The gods wore it, the priests wore it, the dead were wrapped in it too, faced judgment. The basin stones were pitted from generations of use. Mena knew exactly which grooves held water too long, which were best for beating, and which dried. And personal linens from noble households and walk barefoot to the river's edge. Though the job never changed, the days always did. Some mornings brought thick mists, and the stones were slick underfoot. He might not have worn gold collars or performed rituals in incense-filled halls. But the linen those priests wore, they shared drying space, helped each other haul large batches, and warned each other about difficult clients. He learned which fabrics tore easily after the third wash, and how to mend them discreetly. The Nile, as harsh as it could be, also offered balm. He'd listen to the slap of water against the dock. He'd watch crocodiles sun themselves on the far side. And now and then, he'd doze off, the damp air wrapping around him like a damp linen sheet. Certain households rotated their linens in particular cycles. Certain festivals brought specific garments to wash. The Feast of Opet, for example, involved long processions, thousands of feet marching through streets, staining robes with dust, oil, and ceremonial wine. Sometimes a noble servant would slip him a honey cake in thanks. The dead, after all, were entering the afterlife, and every detail mattered. Once, a priest who had watched him work offered a quiet compliment. "You clean with more care than our own act." It wasn't much, but it stayed with Mena for years. The aftermath always meant 3 days of washing. In some cases, the priesthood found the claws ritually unsuitable, and they were sent back for cleaning, reblessing, or disposal. He could tailor a temple garment by smell alone and sense, myrrh, and sweat. The washermen were often given strict instructions. Wash it 7 times. Dry it under filtered sunlight only, and do not allow it to touch the ground. No tombs with murals. No statues in limestone. They gossiped about scribes, joked about priests, and cursed when temple workers brought blood-stained offering cloths without warning. Quietly, in the narrow gap between labor and exhaustion, the altar cloths, the burial shrouds, he had scrubbed those. He may not have written fluently, but he knew the meaning of the symbols embroidered into priestly linen. He recognized the cartouche of the reigning pharaoh. He knew the difference between a sun disk and a feather of mat. His wife tended a small patch of vegetables near their dwelling. His daughter, barely tall enough to reach a tunic line, would bring him flat bread and fig paste in the mid-morning heat. He had poured his sweat and skin into their preparation. In a world ruled by divine kings and cosmic automa, Admena's small routines contributed to that balance, and someone had to keep it clean. Mena understood this in his bones. The beat whist of the fabric against stone was more than habitat, was a sacred obligation. And sometimes, things went wrong. There were always other sons of laundrymen, freed workers from temple estates, and aged laborers too weak for construction but still strong enough to beat cloth. The Nile never stopped flowing, and neither did the city's need for clean robes. A bird might drop waste on a nearly dry garment. A new assistant might overuse natron, leaving cloth stiff and no trial, no discussion, just replaced. Or, worst of all, a noble might accuse the washerman of theft, claiming the sash had gone missing, even if it never existed. Mena had seen good men dismissed for such claims. You see, despite their importance, washermen were entirely replaceable. Some washermen banded together in quiet alliances. Mena had his own tricks. He knew how to remove grease with crushed lotus root. Sometimes, if he finished early, Mena would sit by the bank and rest his hands in the water. Not for cleaning, just for relief. His home, humble and unadorned, was shared with his wife and young daughter. They lived simply, but Mena wasn't uneducated. Washermen in cities like Thebes often picked up bits of temple language, and over time he began to recognize patterns. Mena had no say in this divine pageantry, but his hands bore the consequence of it. Still, not every moment was difficult. Some days, the breeze was kind, and the loads light. Perhaps the most bittersweet task came with funerary linens. These were the bandages and shrouds used to wrap the dead, especially nobles and important temple officials. They had to be immaculate. The process was meticulous. The cloth had to be untorn, completely free of stains or discoloration, and ritually pure. Mena followed every instruction, and then, in a strange twist of fate, he sometimes recognized the same linens, again months or years later being returned to the washerman after an embalming ceremony. What did Mena feel then? A strange familiarity, Perhaps a recognition of labor that had traveled to the edge of the afterlife and returned. We don't know. But it's safe to assume he kept working, because that was the only option. The washermen had no guilds, but their labor left. Mock traces invisible to the eye, but woven into the very fabric of a civilization. Without them, no pharaoh would have glistened in white. No priest would have stood immaculate before a god. No sacred procession would have felt properly divine. And still, no one wrote their names. So the question hangs over the river like a low mist. When a civilization depends on you, but refuses to remember you, was your service in vain? The Nile has always been patient. Long after kingdoms crumble and palaces fade into sand, the river continues to flow. It remembers quietly, without ceremony. And so, as we reach the end of Mena's story, we return once more to the shallows of that ancient river, where linen once rippled in the wind and the labor of hands long gone was rinsed clean each day. The rhythm, the simplicity, while others in the city schemed for position. He moved water and cloth one act, repeated 4 years, with care, ordinary, repetitive, overlooked tasks. We see him in the fragments of linen recovered from burial chambers, some stiffened by time, others still bearing faint signs of folding. He would have cleaned it, all clad in immaculate white linen that shimmered in the sunlight like woven light. We see him in the painted murals of tombs, where men kneel beside stone basins, their muscles drawn with exaggerated realism, their hands caught mid-motion as they beat and twist wet cloth. We even see him in the ledgers kept by temple administrators, noting the quantity of clean garments received and the occasional fine imposed for garments returned blemished by earth. All of these evidence of a man who never sought to be known. He only sought to keep things clean. If it was heavy with sin, you were devoured by Amit, the soul. But if it was light, you passed on to the field of Ridza Mira world, of peace, where work was gentle and no hunger lingered. By the time Mena reached his later years, his body would have borne the cost of that quiet effort. Just a steady rhythm of peaceful labor, in the knowledge that what he did, though unseen, was essential. Mena may have trained others, perhaps his own sons or neighbor boys needing work. Not riches, those who bent their backs and cracked their hands to clean what others do, who asked for no credit and were given none, who believed that purity mattered, even if no one noticed. Its legacy, less pristine, not renowned, but perhaps something simpler. They ensured that the spiritual machinery of a civilization could function without interruption. They kept the temples respectable. The priest is worthy, the dead properly dressed for the afterlife. He would have shown them how to spot flaws in a tunic's weave, and a body that no longer ached when the work was done. That kind of life leaves no written legacy, but it leaves the texture of a society held together not by kings, but by tasks. Toward the end of his life, Mena may have watched a royal procession, priests, offerings, dancers, carts of tribute, and finally, the pharaoh himself. Mena would have recognized the fabric. Perhaps no one else watching that parade thought of the hands that scrubbed it. But Mena didn't need recognition. He knew, and in a way, so do we. The Egyptians believed that in death, your soul would be judged. Your heart was weighed against the feather of truth. One wonders what Mena hoped for in that moment. A basin beside a slow river, a pile of linen that never stiffened, a breeze that dried each sheet perfectly. No more late deliveries. No more temple cloths returned for impurity. That's what the washermen of Egypt gave the world. Not glory, not monuments, but cleanliness, ritual, order. And before you drift away, consider this question, as eternal as the river itself. When the world only remembers the results, but not the hands that made them possible, who then are the true builders of civilization? Let's travel forward now into the early twilight of the Roman Empire, marble Rome of Julius Caesar and Senate halls. But the quieter, dimmer centuries that came after, a time when borders shrank, roads crumbled, and the empire itself flickered like a tired candle. In this fading world, we meet a man whose life was marked by repetition, not a general or an emperor, but a monk. His name is unknown. His monastery, perhaps somewhere in Gaul or northern Italy, stood half forgotten even in his own day. Cold in the winters, damp in the summer, a place where silence and ink ruled more than law or coin. Roads that once connected vast cities were swallowed by forests. Trades, cities shrank, and more importantly, books disappeared. He was, by all accounts, bored, and that boredom may have saved an empire's memory. It's easy to forget how fragile knowledge is. In the centuries after Rome's fall, in the Westrafle, the 5th century CE Europe entered what many call the Dark Ages. Rome had thousands of them. Papyrus scrolls, wax tablets, and codices, histories, treatises, plays, speeches. But papyrus does not survive damp climates well. Fire, neglect, and insects claimed most of what the empire had written. And yet, some texts survive. The monastery is still dark. The only light, a small lamp flickering in the scriptorium, a cold stone room filled with wooden desks and the ever-present scent of ink, parchment, and mildew. He wraps himself in his wool robe, still damp from yesterday's rain, and walks silently to his workbench. He dips his quill into the inkwell, steadying his hand. Not because of kings, not because of libraries. Next to it, a blank sheet of vellum skin, scraped and stretched, expensive and precious. Creativity is not his goal, but the monk copies it anyway, pausing only to warm his fingers near the lamp. But because of bored monks, let's picture this one. He wakes before dawn, summoned by the bell. But inside the scriptorium, the work continues, uninterrupted. He is not writing anything new, but here, in the cold hush of his monastery, the loudest thing is the scratch of quill on parchment. He is copying. In front of him lies an older manuscript, perhaps, from the Roman period, its ink fading, its edges chewed by time. And so, he begins. Perhaps he took extra care when copying Pliny the Elder's natural history, fascinated by strange animals and herbal recipes. They were shelved, sometimes read by the next monk in line, sometimes forgotten in the monastery's cellar. Letter by letter, word by word, line by line. The only reason we know of certain Roman engineering feats or political theories, because a monk, somewhere, kept copying them, year after year, even when no one seemed to care, and never heard an orator's booming voice. The empire he reads about seems like a myth. Some copied military texts, others preserved medical advice, religious commentary, philosophy, or agriculture manuals. Often, they didn't even understand the content, or copied biblical commentaries with marginal beasts, strange shapes etched in by restless hands seeking escape. A Roman philosophical treatise might be erased and replaced with a saint's sermon, but sometimes the old text lingered faintly beneath. And centuries later, with ultraviolet light, modern scholars rediscovered what the monk had once erased, but they copied, because the act of preserving was holy, and yet it was real. And by copying its words, he holds on to that ghost. He does not rush. Errors mean waste, and parchment is hard-won each sheet, representing the labor of a butcher, a tanner, and a scribe. The opening lines of it's dry stuff, lists of weapon maintenance, descriptions of drills, the ideal width of marching road. He does not care for war. He has never seen one, but he copies, not by those who shouted, but by those who simply copied, because that is his task. He may glance out the narrow window, watching fog roll over the forest. Perhaps a deer steps between the trees, perhaps a storm brews, and as he writes, he thinks not about glory or reward, but what about the strange silence of his time? In the days of the Caesars, the world was noisy, full of shouts and marketplaces, clattering chariots, and distant calls of conquest. He has likely never seen a Roman road, never stood in a forum. The monks of this era didn't choose what to preserve with any particular plan. It was believed that words carried moral weight, that transcription was a kind of prayer, that the labor of writing, even if though was service to the divine. Our monk may have had favorites. Perhaps he secretly preferred Cicero to Virgil. Maybe he found Lucretius odd but oddly compelling. He didn't write for himself. His copies weren't published. And yet, when the Renaissance dawned centuries later, it was these forgotten copies, made by monks like him, that scholars rushed to uncover. The only reason we have Tacitus, for instance our primary source for Imperial Romus, because a handful of early medieval monks painstakingly reproduced his annals by hand. And it wasn't just Roman texts. The monk may have preserved older Greek works, translated through Latin, intermediaries or regional histories from tribal chieftains. He may have recorded church council decisions. Sometimes, monks used palimpsest, scraping old texts off parchment to reuse the vellum, so even his mistakes had value. It's strange, isn't it, that a man who lived in cold silence, bound by vows, hunched over ink and skin, could outlast emperors, armies, and gods. That is boring, repetitive, tasty, slow copying of old words into new books could shape what we know of an entire world. That the future would rest on the shoulders of someone who probably died believing he made no mark at all. So, as you settle deeper into your own quiet tonight, consider this. How much of our world has been built, not by brilliance, but by patience, not by invention, but by repetition. By midday, the light in the scriptorium has shifted. Thin beams pass through the narrow slits in the stone walls, falling across shelves, stacked with manuscripts, some new, others cracked and brittle from age. The silence is thick, broken only by the scratch of quills, the faint turning of vellum pages. The room smells of ink, old leather, beeswax polish, and time. He breathes in deeply, letting the mustiness settle into his lungs. Then he returns to the task, copying line 112 of a Roman treatise on duty and ethics, written by Cicero some 800 years earlier. But he trusts that their value is greater than his understanding. And the muffled steps of a fellow monk, placing another roll on a nearby shelf. But even in those moments, his mind returns to the words he has written. And in the margin, a rough drawing of a dog chasing its tail, with the note, "Why is the circle not broken?" A philosophical question, a joke, or just a daydream of a tired scribe. There's a rhythm to them, a pulse. He begins to recognize certain cadences, how Cicero structures an argument, and how Pliny catalogs nature like a ledger of the gods. Our monk pauses. These may not seem vital to his cloistered world, but he copies them anyway. The plants, listed fennel, rue, and wormwood are still grown in the monastery garden, but his ink traces the edges of a vanished empire, and in doing so, keeps the shape of it intact. A continuity of daily life, health, food, thought, language that threads from the ancient world into his dim, stone-bound present. He knows their shapes. He smells them as he walks past after prayers. He stares at a line he's just perhaps from Seneca. Perhaps one day someone will need to know how the Romans kept wheat from rotting, or how they diverted water into fields. A crude little face, In the corner of a page, some monks add riddles or jokes, scribbled in small hand. These tiny rebellions of boredom slip between the lines of military manuals and theological debates. Across much of Europe, books have vanished, libraries burned or abandoned. Roman baths are now home to goats. The forums were silenced. But here, in ink and effort, Rome endures. It was because monks like this had kept copying that, though forgotten, his work might someday matter. Or does he simply return to writing unmoved? He stretches his fingers aching from the morning's labor and gently rubs his palm with a cloth. He does not know if anyone will ever read this page. Perhaps the abbot will. Perhaps not, but that's not the point. The act itself, the transcription, is the purpose. It's a small form of resistance against forgetting. This particular monastery, tucked somewhere in the folds of the former Roman Empire, may be one of only a handful, still preserving Roman thought. He writes slowly, carefully. Latin is no longer anyone's native tongue. It is a sacred language now. Not a living one. The meanings of some words escape him. Outside, the wind howls. The monastery walls creak. Perhaps a storm gathers in the trees. But inside the scriptorium, a single man, hunched in silence, holds off the dark one letter at a time. He takes short breaks to attend prayers in the chapel, to help in the kitchen, or to sweep stone corridors. Occasionally, he adds marginalia, not because he wishes to be remembered, but because it helps him stay awake. A doodle here, a tiny animal there. Imagine this. On one sheet, a precise passage from Virgil's Aeneid. He doesn't know it, but centuries later, these flourishes will become priceless to historians, not for their wit, but because they remind us that even the copyists were human. But there is more to this monk's work than literature. He also preserves technical knowledge. In the stack beside him are fragments of Roman agricultural text guides for crop rotation, irrigation systems, and storage techniques. And then there are medical scrolls. He does not understand all the remedies, wine boiled with herbs, incantations for fevers, but the names and recipes are written carefully. In these pages, Rome lives not as an empire, but as a practice. He is part of something he cannot see. He may never leave the monastery. He may never know what happens beyond the surrounding forest. And sometimes his boredom turns to wonder. He stops writing. As is a tale, so is life. Not how long it is, but how good it is what matters. He reads it again. He leans back. He listens to the silence. Does he feel a flicker of meaning? A recognition that he is a link in a chain of thought? There's no way to know. But what we do know is this. Without monks like him, the past would have vanished completely. When the Renaissance erupted, centuries later, when scholars rediscovered Roman philosophy, mathematics, and engineering, it was not because the ruins had spoken. Even when they didn't understand the full importance, even when they were tired, even when they were bored, so many of our foundational texts, Cicero's Ethics, Tacitus, Histories, Euclid's Geometry, Galen's Medicine, were saved, not by intention, but by repetition. No glory, no reward, just ink and patience. And as the monk lights his small lamp for the evening hours, he returns once more to his pages. And so the section ends with this quiet question. If you knew no one would ever remember your name, would you still choose to preserve something for the world to come? Evening has settled over the monastery. The last light of day filters through the slits in the stone walls, casting faint lines across the scriptorium floor. The bell has rung for the final prayers, and most of the brothers have gone to the chapel, their voices now echoing faintly through the corridors in Gregorian chant. But our monk remains. He stays behind, seated alone at his desk. The quill in his fingers is frayed and soft at the tip, its strokes less sharp than they were at dawn. Still, he dips it once more in ink and continues, copying the words of a Roman he never met, in a city he has never seen, from a world that has long since turned to dust. His eyes are tired, his shoulders sore. Historia est testis temporam, not ruling, not creating. With luck, It will survive the next century, or 2, or 10. But witnessing, in the smallest, steadiest way, history is the witness of times. He does not smile, but he feels something still, something silent. Maybe not understanding, but recognition. This has been his life. It was never about him. And when he finally lays his quill down for the night, perhaps, for the last time, he does not mark his name. No signature, no inscription. His careful lettering once meant only to fulfill his role became the basis for university curricula, political theory, medical practice, and philosophy. The manuscript will be placed on a shelf, then later bound and stored. And if it doesn't, that's not his concern. His duty was the work. We forget that most of civilization is carried forward not by greatness, but by they will dig through dusty trunks, locked cabinets, and half-rotted chests. They will pull out brittle pages and gasp as they recognize the familiar shapes of forgotten Latin. But he also knew discipline. He knew how to keep showing up, even when no one was watching. Especially then. What happens next is in the hands of time, and time is not generous with memory. Without ever knowing if his pages would be read, centuries later, Renaissance scholars will travel to ruined monasteries and remote abbeys, between thought and oblivion, between the voice of Cicero and the ears of Erasmus, Pliny, Seneca, Virgil, Vegetius, and Galen, and they will realize, with slow AW, that someone had preserved it, all quietly, while the world outside descended into silence. He ties the leather binding, places the codex on the shelf, and walks out into the corridor, his sandals slapping softly against a stone. Our monk, nameless, faceless head helped save the bones of Western civilization, without understanding what that would mean, without seeking credit. But his lines were read, his manuscripts were copied again, printed in presses, and translated into other tongues. That is the paradox of preservation. The smaller the ego, the greater the legacy. And perhaps this is what we miss in our rush to celebrate greatness. Not by leaders, but by labor. Not by moments of brilliance, but by centuries of quiet repetition. Our monk knew boredom. He knew aching hands. He knew damp walls, cracked candles, and broken sandals. He was a bridge between worlds, between Rome and the Renaissance. And while he may have believed his own life insignificant, it was his daily act of preservational copying, reading, storing, and protecting that made memory possible. He did not seek immortality, but he gave it to others. And so, as the final page is copied and the candle flickers low, the monk closes the manuscript gently. He disappears into darkness, and yet he remains, because someone must have stayed behind and copied the words. Because someone believed that even forgotten things deserve to be remembered. Because someone without acclaim or applausios to do the boring, faithful work that allowed the Roman Empire to echo centuries beyond its fall. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, ask yourself, tonight we shift from the scriptoriums and riverbanks of the ancient world to the misty, forested hills of 17th century Bavaria. Not the grand courts of the Holy Roman Empire, not the battlefields of the 30 Years' War, but a sleepy patchwork of villages, where life was marked by seasons, not centuries, where harvest, firewood, and livestock governed the rhythm of every day. And in this quiet land, a strange and almost laughably small conflict broke out, something now known in a handful of obscure records as the goat tax riots. Yes, goats, not a rebellion over religion, not a protest against foreign armies. His family had survived famines, plague years, and war bans. They had rebuilt roofs after storms, redug wells after drought, and somehow always kept a few animals in the pen. But a tax on goats, and the villagers who simply couldn't take one more thing. Let's begin in a village like Oberstanache, nestled among wooded hills and damp meadows, where narrow footpaths wound through cabbage fields and timber frame houses sagged with age. In one of those houses lived a man named Hans Bauer, a name so common it practically meant farmer. Hans was like every other man in Oberstanache, tired, practical, and tethered to the earth. Most precious of all, the goat. A single goat could give a family milk for cheese, a little meat, even warmth from its hide. In hard times, a goat could mean the difference between malnutrition and survival. Every house in Obersteinach had at least one. Goats were the poor man's cow, hardy, small, and not picky. And then the edicts came. It was delivered not by a soldier or a noble, but by a tax clerk. Pudgy, pale, wearing too much perfume. The third, barely 6 months old, was meant to replace the second. It was planning, not luxury. He stood in the village square and read it aloud in a nasal voice, trying to sound more important than he was. By decree of the Electoral Council of Lower Bavaria, all households maintaining more than one goat shall remit to the crown a livestock tax of 2 pfennigs per quarter, per head, above the permitted limit of 1. Hans was there, along with the village miller, the blacksmith, the cobbler, and the brewer. They passed bread, shared old ale, and talked. The villagers stared. Some squinted, others scratched their heads. What did it mean? Hans whispered to his neighbor. 2 pfennigs per goat. For what? They barely let us graze anymore. And then the real insult came. Over the past decade, their modest existence had been pecked to death by small levies, wood-gathering fees, tolls at the bridge, new dues for grain, and fines for using the village press without noble oversight. The one the children named, the one who recognized their voices. But the goat tax, that was different. The permitted limit was 1 goat per household. The Bauer family had 3. One farmer painted black spots on 2 goats, so they'd resemble the same animal. A few goats were walked to neighboring villages during inspections, and then walked back at night. Most claimed only 1 goat. The books said otherwise, but enforcement was inconsistent. The state, after all, had bigger problems: skirmishes, border disputes, famine rumors. It was not it was survival. 1 goat's milk fed the children. Another was nearing the end of its usefulness, perhaps because he'd once argued too loudly in the tavern, perhaps just by bad luck. But when the inspectors returned in early spring, they brought soldiers, but the taxman didn't care. The edict was posted in the village tavern, nailed with exaggerated ceremony. It had a wax seal, it bore a crest, it was real. And so the villagers gathered that night, candles flickering, smoke curling into the rafters. Not yet, but murmured. Murmurs that grew heavier with each round. Fined heavily, forced to sign a statement of compliance. Word spread quickly. The tax wasn't the first. 1 was found atop the councilman's carriage. Another wandered into church and stood unmoving in the aisle during Mass. Because this tax touched something personal. Not a coin traded. Not a measure of barley sold, but the warm, bleeding creature in the yard. It was, in a way, the last straw. Not into the forest, not into the mountain, but into the streets. Hans did not propose a riot that night, but someone no one remembered who suggested simply not paying. Let them come and count the goats, someone muttered. They won't find them. And so, a quiet rebellion began. His goats were still there, hidden by neighbors. He resumed his life, never quite the same, but never alone in his defiance. But the story endured in oral tradition, carried on in village songs, passed between generations, until the memory of bleeding resistance became part of the land's rhythm. At first it was clever. The villagers claimed the goats were strays, wild, unclaimed, not by force, but by stubborn refusal to let go of what little was theirs. Goats were moved indoors during collection days. Some were dyed with soot to appear older or younger. And the record shows something curious. By the following year, the goat tax was quietly revised, still on the books, but the enforcement ceased. For months, it worked. The tax clerks came, scribbled their notes, and left confused. Few villagers paid the new goat tax. But then, an example had to be made, and Hans Bauer was chosen. Perhaps because he had 3 goats. They knocked on Hans' door at dawn. His wife opened it. The children were still asleep. They demanded to count the livestock. Hans refused. They entered anyway. 3 goats were found, bleeding and confused, huddled behind the stove. Hans was arrested, hauled to the town's regional seat. and something snapped. The following week, dozens of villagers across the valley released their goats. It was a kind of silent riot. Goats wandered through town squares, climbed steps, knocked over baskets, chewed tax notices, and when the officials returned, they were met not with weapons, but with laughter. "You may tax our goats," said one, "if you can catch them." The protest lasted weeks. Soldiers came. A few arrests were made. But most villagers remained defiant, because it wasn't worth it. Because even bureaucracies know when they've picked the wrong fight. Hans Bauer returned to his village after 3 weeks in custody. And the goat tax riots, they were never called that in official histories. So tonight, as you settle deeper into rest, let this thought stay with you. What if the history that mattered most wasn't made in capitals, but in barns? Not by kings, but by villagers. By mid-spring, the valleys of Lower Bavaria were alive with more than birdsong and thawed creeks. They buzzed with goats everywhere, not just in the barns and pastures where they belonged, but roaming freely in footpaths, chewing the corners of tax notices, tacked to chapel doors, blocking carts along muddy roads. They were in the orchards, in the schoolyards, even on the steps of the local registry office, where a goat famously relieved itself just inches from the council seal. But what the villagers lacked in weaponry, they made up for in goat-led absurdity. For months now, what had started as a quiet refusal to comply had evolved into a passive yet disruptive rebellion. No one raised arms. No barricades were built. If anything, the fine lines around his eyes deepened with a certain calm fury. He said little, but he noticed everything. The nervous twitch in the village clerk's hand when discussing the new grazing regulations, the way his neighbors hushed when soldiers passed, the way people looked to him not as a leader, but as a signal. And behind it all were people like Hans Bauer. Hans had returned to Obersternach following his brief imprisonment, thinner but not broken. They're peasants. Survival demanded cooperation, not confrontation. So when the goat tax threatened their way of life, the villagers didn't respond with open rebellion. They responded with networks. Resistance is part of their blood. Old women sat by the roadside pretending to sell herbs. But in truth, they were watching troop movements. The regional governor, a man named Otto von Habsburg, a minor noble more interested in wine than peasantry, had not taken the situation seriously. Inside were lists of who had how many goats, who had paid, who had hidden theirs, and who had fed whose herd in times of need. Quietly, with no title and no fame, it was updated weekly, passed in the baskets of traders, beneath loaves of bread, folded inside fishing nets. At first, he laughed when his steward reported, "The goat tax is meeting resistance." "Let them resist," Otto said, swirling his cup. No villagers in sight, just a silent, unmoving chain of livestock blocking the way. They called it the Feste Unbezelten, Baksta, Feast of the Untaxed Goat, he quoted scripture. The worker is worthy of his food, and argued that taxing the goat was akin to taxing the widow's last coin. There were no banners, no speeches, just dancing, ale, and a great deal of bleating. They didn't care about the goats, but they cared about the idea that if peasants could push back over goats, what else might they resist next? And in time, the goat tax faded not through repeal, but through it was their way of saying, "We haven't forgotten." But as the goats continued to wander through public squares, and as the reports began piling up unpaid levies, forged documents, officials locked out of barns, the laughter faded. One particularly bold village, Kleinstadt, held a festival where everyone wore goat masks. The governor issued new orders, stricter inspections, additional troops to accompany tax clerks, a doubling of fines for non-compliance. But none of it worked. They didn't build monuments of the masked dancers, of the clerk who quit after being surrounded by bleeding in the night. They simply resumed their lives, mending, planting, watching the weather. You see, rural life in the 1600s was already brutal, harsh winters, unstable harvests, roaming soldiers from distant conflicts. But in this case, the clergy in some rural parishes sympathized. After all, they too depended on goat milk, goat cheese, and hides for robes and books. And more than that, they feared losing their parishioners to starvation. One village hid goats for another. Children were trained to whistle warnings when tax collectors neared. And then there was a goat book. It wasn't truly a book, just a bundle of cloth-bound pages passed quietly between hamlets. Hans Bauer helped to maintain it. To an outsider, it looked like nothing, but it was, in essence, a ledger of resistance. Meanwhile, the officials were growing desperate. When a clerk named Matthias Grubenwald arrived to collect the seasonal toll in the nearby village of Rotten, he was greeted with a strange scene. A line of goats, tied in pairs, stretching across the main road. When he tried to proceed, one of the goats headbutted his horse. He turned around. Word of such acts reached the governor. And now, even the city dwellers, usually dismissive of rural issues, began to pay attention. And that's when the church got involved. Historically, the church had sided with the state. Taxes funded. Bishops sat on councils. In one parish, a priest named Father Anselm gave a sermon titled God Screeches and Caesarus Greed. His sermon, of course, was reported, but by then, it was too late. The bureaucracy was collapsing under its own absurdity. Officials couldn't enforce the law. Clerks falsified reports out of fear. Soldiers grew bored and abandoned their posts. It remained in official records, but no one paid it. No one collected it. It became a footnote. And life continued. Hans Bauer kept his goats. The goat book was buried beneath the village, well, wrapped in oilcloth. The villagers never declared victory. But in taverns, around fire pits, and at weddings, the stories were told of the time goats flooded the town square, of the march of the horns. And Hans, he remained who he had always been. A farmer, a father, a man of dirt and hay and quiet days. But in the eyes of his neighbors, he had become something else. To a man who did not fold when folding would have been easier. And perhaps that is what made the goat tax matter at all. Because it wasn't really about the goats. It was about survival, dignity, and the simple truth that even the poor have limits. So as you drift off tonight, think of those quiet hills, those shivering villages, and the soft thump of hooves on muddy roads, and ask yourself, when absurdity becomes law, is refusal the first act of wisdom? Years passed. The goat tax remained in the legal code of Lower Bavaria, buried beneath lines of outdated statutes, still official, still valid, but functionally ignored. It became a formality, like so many decrees issued from distant desks by men in powdered wigs, who had never smelled wet straw or crouched beside a barn in winter. And in Oberstanacht life carried on. Hans Bauer aged slowly, the way people do when their days are tethered to the land. His beard grew grayer. His joints stiffened. His sons took over the heavy lifting. It wasn't needed anymore. There were no more inspections, no more fines. But it was kept safe all the same, like a sacred ledger of the moment when they had remembered that their dignity did, in fact, have boundaries. He still tended the goats, though with more talking and less chasing. The animals knew his voice. The villagers knew his silence. By then, the goat book had been sealed and hidden not out of fear, but out of reverence. It was a sense that they had all participated in something quiet but powerful, a shared act of children born after the riots knew the story. They heard it on winter nights, while their fathers mended harnesses by firelight. Not revolution, but something far more subtle and perhaps more durable. No one had put it there, at least. No one admitted to it. But there it stood, tail twitching, chewing the corner of the gospel book. Tell the one about the church goat again, they'd beg, and someone would always tell it. The governor eventually turned his attention elsewhere, and slowly the goat tax faded into rumor. He was gathering stories about rural superstition and stumbled on a tavern full of old men playing cards. How during one of the inspection days, a goat had somehow slipped into the sanctuary and climbed onto the altar during Mass. The priest had paused mid-sermon and simply said, "Amen," before sitting down. The villagers took it as a sign, so did the inspectors. But what truly lingered wasn't just the image of goats in odd places. Not rebellion. Exactly. A refusal. They had refused to accept that survival itself was taxable. They had refused to accept that something as essential, humble, and familiar as a goat, the animal of the poor, should be burdened with bureaucracy. They had refused, in short, to be told what part of their own lives was a luxury. And their refusal worked not because they fought, but because they persisted. His goats were still there. The same pen, the same path to the stream. No monument marked the spot. No plaque noted its contents. His youngest grandson, barely old enough to carry a bucket, helped with the morning chores. The tax collectors stopped coming, and those who didn't, well, they were probably inventing a new tax somewhere else. Years later, a scholar from Munich passed through Oberste-Noche. They told him about the goat tax. He laughed, took notes, moved on. A silent ledger. A festival with paper masks and no banners. In his published treatise, he dismissed the tale as local folklore, likely exaggerated, of dubious origin. But he missed the point entirely, because the villagers hadn't resisted for recognition. They hadn't carved their names into trees or made grand declarations. They had simply kept going. The resistance was quiet, slow, and collective, and in that way, it was nearly impossible to crush. Hans Bauer died an old man, beneath the same roof he'd repaired dozens of times. At Hans's funeral, no one mentioned the tax. There was no need. The people who mattered already knew. The goat book remained buried for generations. Eventually, it disintegrated, paper returning to soil, ink fading into the earth. But the memory lived on, and in some ways, it still does. Because throughout history, moments like this repeat, when ordinary people push just slightly too far, decide not to revolt, but to simply withhold consent. Not loudly, not violently, but steadily, and often through the most mundane of means, a hidden goat. So tonight, as you rest your head, perhaps beside a window, half open to the quiet of night, think not of empires or armies, but of something much smaller. A man in a damp wool coat, standing in a field with 3 goats. A man who said nothing fancy, wrote nothing down, but quietly reminded the world, you can take much from us, but not everything. Tonight, we drift even further back in time, to the sunlit shores of the Aegean Sea, to the ancient island of Crete, where civilization bloomed long before Athens carved its philosophies in stone. This was the land of the Minoans, a people who built labyrinthine palaces, painted vibrant and vanished into the folds of time with barely a whisper. But we're not here to talk about palaces or kings. We're here for the pottery shards and the broken lives behind them. These ceramic pieces lie scattered across floors, buried beneath ash, mixed with soil and bone. They are chipped, scorched, and faded off on. Nothing more than curves and corners. Thousands of fragments have been uncovered in places like Naissus, Phaistos, and Mallia, once bustling centers of trade, worship, and governance. Museum drawer filler, the bits left behind when history walks away. Too many, they are just junk, but to the patient eye, these shards tell the story of the ordinary, the unrecorded, the unglamorous. A jug split at the neck might whisper of a hurried departure. She lived around 1500 BCE in a modest quarter, just outside the palace complex of Her home was narrow and shaded, its walls painted with simple lines, nothing grand, but enough to reflect the sun. It carried grain, fish, wine, and honey. It was fragile, yes, but essential. A cup melted slightly on one side might recall the heat of a fire that ended more than dinner. She was a potter's daughter, married to a fisherman who spent more time away than home. The sound had been soft, a single note, like a sigh. She'd tried to mend it with pitch, wrapping the wound with linen and resin. It held for a few days. Then, during an early morning haul from the cistern, it split again, this time down the side. Water soaked her tunic. She cursed under her breath and carried the shards home. Her fingers were calloused, her hair tied with string. She cooked over a clay hearth and spent her days weaving, washing, and shaping pots. With her father, when he needed help, they might label Erasone's discarded pot as household vessel, unpainted, utility class, estimated date, LMIB, period. A single broken bowl may speak of a dropped meal, that she had once set it down too fast and chipped the base, that she had washed it carefully with water drawn at dawn while the street was still cool and quiet. So she ground the shards beneath her foot, swept them into a pile, and carried them to the rubbish pit behind the house. Each shard is an artifact of use, and each use belonged to a person likely nameless, certainly forgotten, but once very real. Let us imagine one such person. She ducked, heart pounding, arms over her head. Dust fell from the rafters. The air tasted of ash and fear. Her name is lost, but we'll call her Erisone, after an old word for olive harvest. Erisone wasn't a noble woman, salvaged others, but many she left behind. Storage jars, cooking bowls, oil lamps, and water jugs, still ringing faintly with the memory of use. No patterns, no glazer, just terracotta and ash, and the faint fingerprints of a tired hand. Most mornings, she fetched water from the communal cistern, balancing a wide-lipped amphora on her hip. Her pots were not ceremonial, they were useful. Thousands of years later, someone with a brush and a clipboard would uncover them. Still, pottery was life. In a world without glass or metal utensils, for common folk, clay was everything. Everyone knew this. She treated the vessels with care. Every faded surface speaks to the rhythm of a life not important enough to be written down, but vital enough to be lived fully. But not all care could prevent breakage. She remembered the day her best water jar cracked. Her father found her scraping the clay for reuse. Better to shape a new pot, he'd said. Broken ones hold bad luck. She didn't believe in bad luck, but she believed in starting over. That pit would one day be a dig site, but back then, it was just a hole in the ground filled with broken memories. Archaeologists today catalog such fragments carefully. They note the curvature, the temper of the clay, and the angle of the rim. But what they cannot record is that Erisone had chosen that vessel because it fit her hands just right, that she had used it every day. These are the details pottery doesn't carry but which still cling to it invisibly. And then came the earthquake. Erisone had just pulled bread from the hearth. She felt the tremor beneath her feet, a ripple, then a lurch. The walls groaned. A jug tipped and shattered. It lasted seconds, maybe less. When it was over, she stood among fallen vessels. Cracks ran through the floor. Her father's kiln had collapsed. Outside, others screamed. A corner of the palace smoldered. People ran carrying bundles, bread, cloaks, and children. And Erisone, she swept the shards into a pile, as she always had. But this time, it felt different, more final. She kept a few pots. The fragments were still warm from the quake's heat, and that's how they were found, buried beneath layers of soot and plaster, tucked under what remained at the room's edge. They would be cleaned, sorted, and labeled. Placed in a box, they would sit in a museum basement for years, perhaps forever. And yet, every curve still remembers the fingers that held it. Every crack recalls the pressure of use. And so, the question lingers softly in the dust. What stories do we discard every day, never knowing that one day, someone may sift through the pieces, trying to find us there? The days after the earthquake were filled with the dull, hard business of rebuilding. For the wealthy, this meant sending for builders and scribesmen who came with ledgers and orders. For people like Erisone, it meant digging by hand, patching walls with mud and straw, and sleeping under open skies, while the cracked rafters above her home were shored up with whatever timber could be found. Her father, once so nimble at the wheel, had injured his wrist when the kiln collapsed. He could still guide clay, but the shaping took longer. So now, it was Erisone who spun the wheel. Hands caked in dry and slipped, sweat stinging her eyes. Just contain us something to hold the pieces of their disrupted lives. She had never planned to take on the trade fully, but life didn't always offer choices. The bodies were lopsided, but they worked, and they sold. Their stock was gonna put you. Their stock was gone shattered in the quake or buried. The neighbors came anyway. We need bowls. Anything. For oil. For barley. Erison nodded, wiping her hands. Shards tumbled together like broken teeth. And she never imagined, never even considered that someone, someday, might find them and call them evidence. To the sea, restless and blue in the fading light. To the occasional laughter brief, but sincere. It had been one of the first she'd made without her father's guidance. The slip was uneven. The handle is too narrow. But it fit her hand. It had carried her first batch of olive oil to market. And once, during a celebration, she had drunk watered wine from it and laughed so hard she spilled some on her tunic. It wasn't artistry they wanted. Rituals were simpler. Markets are quieter. The priests no longer paraded in jewel-toned robes. Even the palace, once a humming center of Minoan grandeur, now felt hushed. A reminder, maybe, of the life she hadn't planned but had grown into, day by dusty day. And so, the pots she made were plain. No time for decoration. No time for balance. Really, the rims weren't perfect. In the evenings, she would sit on the threshold of a half-repaired home and listen to the low murmur of families eating together. Not from a fire in the village. She saved some to repurpose, grinding them down into grog, to mix with new clay, but many she simply cast aside. The sun dimmed, and the sky was in tea, the color of iron. Crops withered in poisoned soil. And slowly, over months, the rhythm of life collapsed. The earthquake had shifted something beneath the surface, both literally and figuratively. It had taken the weight out of things. The sea pulled back unnaturally, only to surge forward in waves that crushed harbors and drowned valleys. What was left were the things too broken to carry. She molded. They cataloged them with numbers, compared them to others, dated them by typology. She shaped, and always there were shards. She left behind the damaged kill, the stacked amphorae, and the goat they hadn't been able to sell. She even left her sleeping mat. It holds the curve of its maker's hand long after the bones have turned to dust. There was a feeling in the air that things might not return to what they had been. It's made by the fragments we refuse to forget. And so, the people adapted. Everyone worked, no matter how carefully she moved. Pots cracked in the kiln, a misfired lid, a warped jar neck, a broken handle. The rubbish heap grew, quietly, in the shadow of her house. There was one vessel she never threw away. It was a jug small. She kept it, even after the lip cracked. It sat on a shelf near her bed. And then came the ash, not from an earthquake, but from a mountain hundreds of miles away. The volcano at Terramata. Santorini erupted with a violence the ancient world had rarely seen. The skies darkened. Ash fell like snow. In Crete, the disaster didn't arrive as fire. It arrived as silence. The air thickened. Trade stopped. Palaces emptied. People moved inland, some across the sea, seeking places where the air did not smell like soup. Erison held on as long as she could. She packed what was left of her pottery. She helped her father, now frail, onto a cart. But not the little jug. That she tucked carefully into a cloth, wrapped in her shawl. And she walked. We don't know where she went. No record tells us. No inscription bears her name. But we know she left because she didn't die there. No body was found in the ashes of her home. No bones beneath the kiln. Shards of bowls, a handle of baize, a thumbprint, faint, but still visible, pressed into a jar's shoulder. And centuries later, when archaeologists came, brushing away centuries of silence, they found these pieces, and maybe, just maybe, one of them noticed the curve of a lip that didn't quite match any style in the books. Maybe someone held it and wondered, who made this? Why does it feel personal? That's the strange thing about pottery. It outlasts memory. It outlasts names. It breaks. Yes, but it doesn't disappear. And so, as we follow the trail of Erison's life, not through monuments, but through shards, we begin to see that history is not made by the intact. Because sometimes the most human stories are the ones found in broken things. And that leads us to ask, what pieces of us will others find, and will they know what they meant? Somewhere along the rocky Cretan coastline, In the months after the skies turned gray, we don't know exactly where she went. Perhaps inland, away from the darkened harbors where trade had stopped. Perhaps toward a village that had survived the ashfall a little better. She had no title, no estate, no parchment bearing her name. She was simply someone who had lived, made things, and now had to leave the place where her things no longer mattered. Or maybe to the hills where barley could still grow, and the sheep had grass to eat. She was not a refugee. Not in the way we think of it today. It was, perhaps, the one object that still tied her to herself. The palatial system that had governed Minoan life, its scribes, priests, and central redistribution began to collapse. Knossos limped along for a time, but the center of culture shifted, and eventually the Mycenaeans from the mainland arrived, bringing a different language, different gods, and different customs. The elaborate bureaucracy of records in sealed jars was replaced by barter, silence, and uncertainty. But she carried something with her. That small jug. It wasn't useful not anymore. Its cracked lip leaked. Its size was too small to store food or oil, but it had become more than a vessel. And it was that the memory of usefulness, the echo of a once normal life, that she clung to as she stepped over riverbed, past shuttered shrines, and into a new, unfamiliar world. All over Crete, others like her did the same. The eruption of Thera hadn't just disrupted life. It had unraveled belief. People abandoned cities. The frescoes peeled. The temples empty. A lip that suggests a picture. A hole where a handle once was. And what of Eris? Perhaps she married into a new village. Perhaps she died quietly in the hills. Her jug buried with her in a humble grave or left under a tree. As a kind of marker. Coarser, smaller, slightly uneven. Not Mycenaean, not local. They seemed to have come from somewhere else. Or maybe she lived long enough to teach her daughter how to shape clay, how to turn a wheel, and how to feel for balance. In wet earth, there are some shards found in land far from the palaces that don't match the local pottery styles. It's tempting, even foolish, to imagine one of them was hers. But still, isn't that the nature of all history? The lamp that gave just enough light to patch a tunic before bed. But it's the broken, boring, necessary things that show us how people truly lived and how they endured. The plate chipped at the edge from too many meals eaten in too little light. To assemble meaning from broken pieces. To find echoes of real people in things they never meant to leave behind. Archaeologists often refer to these shards as diagnostic fragments. Not because they reveal illness, but because they reveal just enough to diagnose what they were part of. But who shaped a world with her hands and left behind pieces that still, somehow, matter? A curve that suggests a bowl. And so it is with lives like Erisone's. A piece hairwork at the wheel. A piece they're a father's kill. A cracked jug, another a departure, silent and unrecorded. Individually, they tell us little. Together, they whisper something true. And in that whisper, we remember that civilizations are not built by kings alone, but by the quiet repetition of survival. The bowl that held lentils, the jug that held seawater for cleaning fish. We are tempted to look past these things, to celebrate what's grand. So when we speak of ancient Crete, let us not speak only of palaces and myths. Let us also speak of Erisone, surrounded by things you use every day. Ask yourself this. If someone were to find what you leave behind, cracked, buried, long forgotten, would it tell them about the life you quietly made? Let us leave the dusty shards of Bronze Age Crete behind now and move forward in time, though not to a battlefield or a royal court. Tonight, we travel to a cliffside, battered by wind and salt, where waves slam endlessly against jagged rocks and gulls cry into the gray. This is a lighthouse, and inside it lives a man who missed an entire war. Not because he ran, not because he refused, but because he was doing his job. The year is 1915, the middle of the First World War. Europe is cracking open at the seams. Trenches stretch from the North Sea to the Swiss border. His uncle died during a storm when the old tower on Sumburg had collapsed. The lighthouse was built there out of necessity, not preference. Ships pass close in bad weather, and without its light, they find the rocks quickly and fatally. And now Robert Chung, quiet, unambitious, manning a structure barely wide enough to turn around in. Millions are being mobilized, but off the coast of northern Scotland, at the edge of the Orkney Islands, stands a lonely lighthouse called Sewell Skerry. And there, in the roaring quiet, stands Robert MacArthur. Boats were requisitioned for patrols, one by one. The support links to distant lights, like Sewell Skerry, were cut off. He is not a soldier. He is not a politician. He is a lighthouse keeper. Third generation. His father tended lamps before him. The plan was simple. 6 weeks on, 2 weeks off, trading shifts with other keepers. Supplies were brought in by boat. Letters passed along with barrels of fuel oil and crates of dried food. The three of them kept the light burning. Not because they were heroes, but because that's what lighthouse keepers do. Sewell Skerry is more rock than island. It sits far from the mainland, lashed by the North Atlantic. Too small for trees, too windy for birds to nest long. Robert arrived just before the war began, part of a regular rotation. But once the war broke out, everything changed. Naval priorities shifted. Supply routes were redirected, and so Robert stayed. The last supply run came in January of 1915, with a note saying they'd return in a... They knew only fog, spray, and the ritual of keeping ships alive by showing them where not to go. They rationed hardtack, caught seabirds, boiled seaweed. Davies grew thin and quiet. Thompson developed a cough. Storms came, then naval mines. Then German U-boats were sighted nearby, and the sea grew hostile knots, just wild, but deadly. Robert was stranded, possibly a torpedoed ship. Robert logged it, noting only light flash SSW, likely distress. Conditions too rough to assist. With him were two others. Thompson, older, meticulous, and prone to lectures, and Davies, younger, excitable, and fond of card games. He thought it was another trick of light, one of the mirages you start to see after too many gray months. They measured oil, polished lenses, logged weather. The journal entries from that time are simple, clipped, because even when you can't save, you can warn. Wind from the west, heavy chop. He imagined what was happening there. Were people still dancing in halls? Were boys he'd gone to school with now carrying rifles in Belgium? Light rotation stuttered. Once they heard a faint message. Armistice negotiations delayed, but by then they didn't know which year it was. Not from memory, but because someone had to. They just kept recording, rotating, polishing, and keeping time by oil and shadow. Signal received faintly. 3 a.m. Unconfirmed. Nothing about the war. They didn't know what was happening in Ypres. They didn't know about the gas attacks or the shifting front lines. Their food ran low in April. Still, they kept the light. One night, in early May, they saw a flicker on the horizon, an explosion far at sea. He wrote it with the same tone he used for barometric readings. It was too far. They could do nothing, but they kept the light burning. Sometimes, Robert would climb to the top just to look out across the water, toward the invisible mainland. Was anyone even alive back home? The silence of the sea was complete. Radio signals were rare, distorted, and sometimes months old. When the relief boat finally came, in March of 1919, the keeper in charge didn't believe it at first. But the boat came. The war was over. The world had changed. Millions dead. Empires have fallen. Borders redrawn. And Robert MacArthur stepped onto the boat with salt in his beard and the logbook under his arm. He'd missed it all. And yet, when asked later if he regretted it, he said only this: "We kept the light. No ship wrecked on our rock." That's what mattered. Because while the world tore itself apart, he preserved a small piece of order. Not for glory. So, as you settle in tonight, away from the waves and the wind, let this thought drift with you. Is it possible that the most important acts in history are the ones that go unseen because they prevented something from happening at all? The boat that finally came in March of 1919 had trouble landing. The sea, as always, was rough. It took several tries to dock safely on the rocks, slim outcropping. When the crew finally climbed ashore, wherein Royal Navy Will Robert MacArthur stood at the top of the lighthouse steps, blinking into the sun, expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken to anyone outside his station in over a year. Thompson and Davies were there, two older, thinner, quieter. They hadn't expected rescue. Not really. They had started to believe that perhaps the war had gone on forever, or that they had been forgotten entirely. But they hadn't been forgotten. Their records were still filed. Their logbook still mattered. The first mate who stepped onto the island was stunned. "You've kept it running," he said. Robert nodded. The ships didn't stop. Indeed, they hadn't. Though naval traffic around Sulskeri had diminished, it hadn't vanished. During the war, destroyers and convoys still passed in the distance, hugging safer waters. Their crews looked for the light. Not for navigation, but for reassurance. Proof that someone was still watching. The mirror was pitted with salt, but still polished daily. The lens rotated, though slower now, by hand. The journal was full. Every wind change, every ship is spotted, every tide turn. What does it mean to preserve a routine while the world breaks? Inside the lighthouse, little had changed. The oil reserves were almost gone. Robert had rationed carefully. There were over 1,400 entries. Most were brief. Some were coded messages that intercepted faintly through the static. Others were more personal. Davies is ill again. Made broth from gold. Maintain the rotation. Record what you see. Even when no one visits. Even when no one answers. Storm broke glass in upper window. Thompson patched with cloth and rope. During peacetime, that meant long stretches of quiet. During war, it meant continuing to exist without context, hearing news only weeks late, if at all, and carrying out routines that no longer fit the moment. Dreamt of peat smoke. Maybe remembering home. One entry, dated December 24th, 1980, read simply, "A local paper called him the watchman who missed the war." Another tried to paint him as eccentric, almost saint. Took a job at a harbor office in Inverness. Never married, never published his journal. He kept the logbook, though, and stored it wrapped in oilcloth in a drawer he never opened. The ships know them. The disaster that never happened because of them never says thank you. Asked to explain why they didn't abandon the post. Why hadn't they tried to signal distress? Why hadn't they No ship tonight. We sang anyway. After their return, they were debriefed. They knew his light. Even if they hadn't seen his face before, they had relied on his vigilance. While men killed and died by the millions, while nations collapsed and maps were rewritten, he upheld a single point of certainty. But what would they have said? The rules had been clear. Keep the light running. Lighthouse keeping had never been a glamorous life. It required isolation, patience, discipline, and above all, a willingness to be unseen. Still, Robert never complained. Not one. He returned to the mainland a quiet man. The press tried to interview him. He dismissed both ideas. He resumed life inland. Occasionally, sailors from that region would see him walk in the docks and nod respectfully. And that's the strange thing about lighthouse keepers. They are known without being seen. The sea knows them, but still, the work. There is an old saying among mariners. The best lighthouse is the one you forget is even there, because that means it's working. And in that way, Robert MacArthur's legacy is profound. A light on time. Each night. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He saved no lives dramatically. He gave no speeches. He wrote no books. But the ships that passed Sulskeri on the warriors knew something few others did. Someone was still awake, and in a world gone mad, sometimes that's the only signal that matters. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep far from the cliffs, far from the cold, far from the signal horns, ask yourself, who's steady? Invisible labor has kept your own ship from running aground. Years after he stepped off that lighthouse rock for the final time, Robert MacArthur rarely spoke about the war. Not because it pained him, not because he didn't care, but because, in a way, he had never truly been part of it. When people asked him where he served, he'd say simply, the North Sea, and leave it at that. He didn't attend parades, didn't join veterans clubs. He spent his days as a port watchman in Inverness, quietly noting tides, inspecting mooring ropes, and filling out forms in a careful, neat hand. It was not glamorous work, but he had never asked for glamour. At night, he'd walk the shoreline out past the warehouses, to the edge of the pier watching the horizon for lights. Sometimes, out beyond the spray, he'd see the flash of another lighthouse, rotating steady as ever, and he would nod to it. After his death, a niece discovered it in a drawer wrapped in waxed cloth, dry and crisp after all those years. Inside were 4 years of handwritten notes, not out of habit, but out of respect. Robert's logbook, the one he kept on Sewell Skerry, was never published, but it was preserved. Some pages were technical lists of repairs, oil usage, and light rotation times. Others were strangely poetic. Ice formed in the northern gutter, wind pressing against the west window like a breath that will not stop, star visible over the horizon at 2:43 a.m. First sign of clear sky in weeks. Heard gulls before seeing them. A good omen, perhaps. And then there were the human entries, just a steady, rhythmic observation of the world. Man taking stock, one day at a time. While the earth convulsed beyond the horizon, Davies coughed blood this morning. He pretends it's salt throat. Thompson lit the lamp early tonight, said he dreamed of a ship that never turned. We boiled the last of the oats. I didn't mind. There was no panic, no drama. The war ended. The soldiers returned home, and the world began rebuilding itself, as it always does. They're tools of avoidance, and those who run them are, by design, invisible. But somewhere in that lighthouse journal, preserved in tight lines of ink, is a record of what it looks like when a person chooses not to abandon their post, even when no one is watching, because that was Robert's war. A war against silence. We remember treaties, but not the slow, sleepless nights of lighthouse keepers, keeping things calm, regular, and uneventful. Against drift, against the slow temptation to stop caring when it seems like no one else does. Historians often argue over whether lighthouses are part of history in the dramatic sense. They rarely factor into major battles or treaties. But that's the point. Lighthouses prevent things from happening. Supply lines disrupted, lives lost, courses altered. They're not monuments to glory, which brings us to the quiet truth at the heart of this story. Just a note in the local paper. Former lightkeeper, age 71, passed quietly in his sleep. Every time someone survives a night at sea, because of a glow in the mist, a few old sailors sent flowers. A retired steward came to the grave. That was all. How much of history was shaped not by action, but by its absence? How many disasters never occurred because someone somewhere was awake, alert, and steady? We remember generals, but not the men who kept cargo ships from crashing on rocks. And yet, if those ships had wrecked, if those lights had failed, then perhaps the war would have changed. But they weren't, because someone kept the lamp trimmed, kept the log filled, kept the oil warm, kept the light moving just as it was meant to. When Robert MacArthur died, there was no ceremony. But in some way, his life endures every time a ship rounds a corner and sees the blink of light they expected to see. And tonight, as you lie warm, far from the roar of the waves, let yourself drift with this final thought. Some people are remembered for what they prevented, for the chaos they quietly held back, for being the light no one saw but everyone needed. When you hear the word Timbuktu, it likely sounds mythical, more fable than fact. A place used to mean the ends of the earth, a joke, a metaphor. But Timbuktu was real, and for a time, it was one of the most important cities in the world. In the 15th and 16th centuries, it stood near the edge of the Sahara, not quite desert, and not quite savanna, or perhaps of the Madrasa, where manuscripts were copied by hand in perfect calligraphy. But tonight, we aren't here for emperors or mosques, a hub where camel caravans loaded with salt and gold met scribes, scholars, and kings. It was dusty, sun-baked and shaped by wind, but it housed libraries the size of small temples. His family wasn't noble, but they were trusted long-time record keepers and scribes, tasked with the most invisible job in the empire, watching the flow of goods. You may know the legends of Mansa, the emperor of Mali, whose pilgrimage to Mecca crashed gold markets across Egypt. We're here for a man named Abu Bakr al-Qadiri and his ledgers, because while kings dreamed and scholars debated, someone had to keep the books. Abu Bakr was born in the early 1500s. In the clay-walled neighborhood near the Gingabor Mosque, he apprenticed young, copying numbers in the margins of tax receipts, learning to count bundles of salt as they arrived by camel from the Tagaza mines in the desert north. His job was not exciting. Most days, he sat beneath a date palm, bent over scrolls made from goat hide, inked with locally made black dye. Their work was slow, often undone by insects, sand, or neglect. That if a city's knowledge could be organized, counted, indexed, then it could survive, even collapse. He listed things. How many camel loads came in? Who owed what to the mosque? Which goods were earmarked for caravan guards? Which sacks of rice were spoiled? Timbuktu had one of the world's largest manuscript cultures, with tens of thousands of texts in circulation. Science, medicine, law, poetry, astronomy, a mix of trade notes, community gossip, and marginalia. He kept careful records of borrowed books. Borrowed books. Abu Bakr was not a scholar, but he was essential, because without men like him, no one would know who had borrowed the works of Ibn Sina, or how many copies of a Sufi commentary were still missing after the last fire. He didn't write the wisdom of the age, but he made sure it wasn't lost. He worked in silence, and whispers of trouble came from the East Raiders' rebellions, instability in the Songhai Empire. Scribes didn't get their names etched in stone. They got worn fingers and dusty robes. But Abu Bakr believed in something simple, that order preserved memory. He began creating his own records, not official ones, but personal ledgers. Caravan arrived from Walada. 17 camels, 3 returned limping. And Abu Bakr still sharpened his reed pen each morning, dipped it in ink, and tallied. Salt wet again. Storehouse roof needs repair. Book of Law returned by Al-Kule. Pages 4 to 6 missing. He swears it was like that. Saw eclipse. Children afraid. Imam gave sermon. That scribes were leaving slowly, one by one, for safer places. He stored them in different homes. Buried one under a basket of millet. Hid another behind a stack of prayer rugs in the mosque storeroom. He wasn't writing history, just tracking life. But in doing so, he created a map not of geography, but of a living city. Trade tallies scratched onto flat pieces of leather and stored under his nephew's bed. They weren't philosophical, but they told the truth. Timbuktu was already fading by Abu Bakr's time. Ink fades, but if one survives, so does memory. Instead, they found thousands of documents in homes, trunks, and boxes, many traced back to anonymous scribes, their names lost. The glory days of imperial patronage were thinning. Trade routes were shifting with the rise of Atlantic ports. The empire that had cradled Timbuktu fractured. The libraries were ransacked. The scholars were exiled or executed. The market fell silent. Still, the city persisted. The market still bustled. The scholars still debated theology in the shadows of adobe walls. He noticed the little things. That camel loads were arriving lighter. That coins from foreign lands were showing up more often in taxes. He said nothing. He just kept writing. His most curious habit was creating duplicates. Every important list of books, taxes, salt bales, debt he copied twice, sometimes 3 times. When asked why, he only said, "Paper burns." He didn't know what would happen, only that something might. And it did. In 1591, Moroccan forces marched into the city, muskets glinting in the Saharan sun. But some records remained, because Abu Bakr, the accountant no one remembered, had buried them. Scrolls tucked inside clay jars, ledgers hidden behind crumbling walls. They weren't beautiful. How much salt passed through? Which books had been read? What the weather was like the year the river ran low? What a day the sky turned red with dust. Centuries later, when researchers and preservationists returned to Timbuktu, they expected ruins, but one ledger had a note in shaky Arabic script, copied by Abu Bakr al-Qadiri, for safekeeping. No further biography, no signature flourish, just a record, a date, a name. Proof that even in a city that would fade into myth, one man believed the act of writing things down was its own kind of resistance. And so tonight, as you slowly drift toward sleep, let yourself imagine a man in linen robes, sitting cross-legged on a floor of packed earth, scratching lines into paper by candlelight, quiet, forgotten, unseen. Ask yourself, if everything around you vanished, what details would you want someone to find centuries later and know about the life you lived? Let us now return to the long, dim corridor where the dust of old ledgers floats lazily in the air. The accountant of Timbuktu, whose real name remains unrecorded, but who was known among clerks simply as the man with 3 inkpots, continued his quiet duties as the city around him shifted with the tides of trade belief in distant empires. It was now the late 15th century. The Songhai Empire had risen in power, and Timbuktu, already famed for its manuscripts and learning, had become a hub of commerce as well. Salt from the Sahara, gold from the rivers of the south, cloth from distant coasts, all of it passed through the city's hands, and someone had to count it. He did not carry a sword or wear a turban of fine dye. But showing a careful count of 100 goats sold, bartered, and divided among 7 families, including 2 children marked as inheritors. No names, just numbers. Empires rose and fell, Mali, Songhai, Moroccan, invasions, and still he sat in that same room. 3 ink dust settled on his shoulders as he copied and revised. Let us now move forward to the end of the story. The room is dimmer than before. The dust is heavier. The inkpots still sit where they always have, but the hands that once moved between them now tremble. It is the twilight of the 16th century. Moroccan forces have marched into Timbuktu, claiming the city as their own. His ink spills more often. He rewrites entries he cannot quite remember making. Where once his window opened to voices of traders and chants from the mosque, now he hears foreign tongues and military boots. His breath wheezes through cracked lips, but each morning he still lifts the lid of his ledger box, still unfolds the records, still notes down the dry, dull arithmetic of life. The scholars are exiled or silenced. Libraries once full of golden calligraphy and intellectual traffic fall quiet. Scrolls are hidden behind clay walls. Some are burned. Many are lost. But the accountant remains. His posture is slower now. He no longer receives visitors. The apprentices are gone. The streets are strange. One morning, a young Moroccan soldier enters, looking for grain records. Others believe they crumbled into dust with the room itself. A minor scribe noted in the margin of an unrelated record, the elder ledger keeper was found at his table, ink on his fingers, pages. The accountant, now nearly blind, gestures slowly to a shelf where camel-hide-bound logs are stacked in order by month, year, and region. A birth, a shipment, a promise, a famine survived. The soldier finds what he needs, nods, and leaves without a word. He never fought in any battle. No salui, no recognition. But the numbers spoke for him, as they always had. It's believed the accountant died in that same room. Shortly after, no one knows what happened to the final entries. Totals, margins marked with small notes in fading script. They are hard to read. Most don't try. Some say they were buried with him. But what remains today in the desert libraries of Mali are fragments, pages with dates. But if you do, you see his fingerprints, his tiny adjustments, his lifetime of dull, precise vigilance. And behind each number, a life. He never ruled. He never traveled far. But he remembered, and through him, the city remembered itself. Let us leave now, stepping gently over the threshold, letting the dust settle again, and wonder, when the rest of history fades into legend and story, will it be the numbers that remember us best? Good evening, friend. Settle in. Let the sounds fade around you. Imagine you're surrounded by the gentle hiss of a kettle on a fire, the soft flick of candlelight casting slow, drowsy shadows on the wooden walls of a quiet cabin. A life lived at the edges of a war most never truly saw. If this calm helps you unwind, you're welcome to tap like and subscribe only if it feels right. Tonight, we drift back to a time of cannon fire and smoke-filled skies, but not the front lines. No, our story takes us somewhere quieter. This is the story of Private Elijah Harper, a Civil War soldier who never fired a shot. Let's begin. It's spring, 1863, not far from the Ohio River, in a village so small it had no post office of its own. A young man with long hands and a quiet way of speaking signed enlistment papers at the county hall. He signed up because the farmer he worked for had gone broke. While others drilled and hollered, Elijah spent evenings helping the cook peel potatoes. He read old newspapers from the trash pile. He made notes about weather patterns and wrote long, meticulous letters to no one in particular, which, at the time, meant staying behind to manage food and tent supplies. His tent mates started calling him the professor, half mocking, because enlistment meant a $300 bounty, because the war was swallowing up everyone else anyway. Then the spring thaw, and still, Elijah Harper had not seen a battlefield. His name was Elijah Harper, 19 years old, tall and thin as a wheat stalk. He wore his only boots year-round and owned just 3 shirts, 2 of them mended with his mother. S.O. curtain fabric, Vicksburg Sherman's March. The nation cracked like dry wood. He sorted and relabeled crates of supplies so thoroughly that visiting captains thought they'd arrived at a General S. depot. Once, he spent 2 entire days redrawing an inventory list. because he noticed a duplication error in the flower count, a place for a dried blanket, or a bit of kind advice. The way souls wore down, depending on terrain, still hadn't marched into a trench or fired into the fog. About lye soap and how different batches reacted to hard water. About the strange green fungus that grew behind the supplies shed in warm months. A courier rode past, dropping a satchel of mixed-up papers, as they often did. Elijah gathered the sheets, sorted them carefully, and found a torn order for a battalion that had been misrouted 3 times already. He always had a pot of chicory tea ready, and he rarely asked questions. He listened, suggests this version be forwarded with haste. Original legibility compromised, and in a war full of orders and shouting, that alone made him rare. His handwriting was confirmed on letters that rerouted food, blankets, and even medicines. Yet no official promotion ever came, no recognition, no discharge papers beyond the usual, no medal. A few weeks later, that general asked, "Who's Harper?" Just a quiet private who never left camp, helped repair boots, tents, and even one man's spectacles with thread from his own collar. They ought to pay you in teaspoons and thread. Harper, you're running a better war than the war itself. The one who stitched their socks, who listened without judgment, who fixed the inventory, so they had clean water for one more day. Elijah didn't sign up out of glory or passion. Elijah was left behind. A quartermaster wrote, "Private Harper's reports are tedious but alarmingly accurate." Another officer said, "He's an odd one, but I trust his eyes more than my own." But from the moment he arrived at the training camp outside Cincinnati, things went a little sideways. He didn't fit, not in the uniform it hung off him like a scarecrow's coat nor in spirit. Still, he showed up, rolled bandages when others trained, learned how to boil coffee without burning it. When the order finally came to deploy, something odd happened. He wasn't injured. He hadn't been dismissed, but a clerk's Mark I little clerical error placed him on reserve logistics detail. He waited 4 weeks, then months. The first frost came. But don't think he was idle. He repaired the torn canvas with painstaking stitches. He built better racks for drying meat. Soldiers came and went, and still he remained. One of them joked, in the background, the world burned. Gettysburg happened, but Elijah remained in his corner of the world counting beans, mending coats, and boiling water. His tent became something of a quiet refuge. He kept journals, many of them tied in string and stacked in an old crate. They contained no tales of glory or bloodshed. Instead, he wrote about boots. Not thrilling, maybe, but telling. He noticed things no one else had time for. By the winter of 1864, he had quietly improved the supply line for 3 regiments. And yet, he still hadn't carried a musket into battle. Was he a soldier or just a caretaker in uniform? One day, Elisha sat on a wooden crate outside the mess tent, watching clouds roll in. He copied it out by hand and added, in his precise penmanship, that note made it all the way to a general's tent. No one really knew. But here's the strange part. Elijah's name appears in dozens of archive supply reports. When the war ended, he simply walked home, back to his mother's faded curtain shirts, his boots with patched soles, and his field notes about beans and fungus. He didn't call himself a hero. He didn't call himself anything. But the men who returned remembered the man who brewed chicory at midnight. A man who never fired a shot, but perhaps saved more than one life. And yet, the question remains. In a war defined by battles, is there room to remember a man who fought only with thread, firewood, and patience? Let's pick up where we left off, with Private Elijah Harper, the soldier who stayed behind. It's early 1865 now. The war is grinding toward its end. Though no one knows that for certain, the mud is thicker, the food is thinner, and yet Elijah remains at his post unarmed, unnoticed, and indispensable. He now oversees 3 tents and a shed, each stacked meticulously, labeled with his careful handwriting. Salted pork, worn boots, wool blankets. But nobody asks him to stop either. He's built a shelf from discarded rifle crates to hold jars of mustard seed, vinegar, and lye soap. No one asked him to do any of this, but there's stew in the pot, and if you add a pinch of salt and a minute of patience, it tastes nearly fine. Everything is tied and twined, not because he's fussy, but because mice had once chewed through the flour sacks, and Elijah doesn't like repeating mistakes. He sharpens quills by the fire and keeps wax paper over the ink. Occasionally, new soldiers arrive and mistake him for an officer. When a tent collapses in the wind, someone mutters, "Harp'll know how to fix it." Just a man with soft eyes, quiet hands, and a steady rhythm. Then he boils water, sharpens quills, and rewraps soap bars in fresh cloth. Another contains sketches of different shovel handles. He's rated them for splintering, grip, and weather resistance. They have names, but no orders. Rank, but no direction. When a soldier wants to send a letter, but can't write, he finds his way to Elijah's candlelit desk and asks, "If you're quiet, the goats don't bite." Not for official record, but because someone ought to. Could you? And Elijah does. Elijah becomes their anchor in the fog of an unraveling war. "I'm no sir," Elijah says with a smile, not looking up from his ledger. "Then we'll need more paper. Men will be writing home." His presence becomes a kind of camp legend. When tempers flare, someone says, "Go talk to Harper." No dramatic, no complaints. The officer in charge frowns as he reads Elijah's name. His journals multiply. One covers the way socks dry fast as if stuffed into the arms of a uniform. A captain shows up with blood on his boots and no clear command. Soldiers drift into camp looking dazed, injured, and directionless. But slowly, there are signs even Elijah can't ignore. No promotions, no citations. You're still marked as reserve detail. The supply trains stop arriving on time. Messages are delayed. The lines are breaking. Someone mutters, "The war's almost done." Elijah listens. He takes it in. One evening, a group of men arrives with no paperwork, just uniforms, bloodied and dirty, their eyes hollow. They ask, "What is this place?" Elijah answers, "It's still Camp Ashwood. You're welcome to stay. Beds in the east tent." He stops to tie off a corner of canvas someone left unlatched. No flag folding. No mention in the regimental history. He stacks 2 loose firewood logs. Adjusts a crooked lantern. No one questions him. They accept bowls of soup. Sleep under patched canvas. He writes their names in his ledger. He just notes the date. Pours more tea. And mends another coat. Places his journals on a shelf. Lights a small fire in the hearth. Boils water. He hears talk of Appomattox, of surrender, of Lincoln, but he doesn't react. Tent ropes fraying. There's a different truth etched in soft ink and quiet certainty. The war ended. Morning tea steeped too long. Not out of sentiment, but because the soap stores needed, and someone misplaced the ink blotter. Again. One day, a young corporal brings word. War's over. The Confederates surrendered. Elijah nods. The corporal laughs. "You're serious?" As a ledger with one candle left, Elijah replies. A week later, a wagon arrives with crates of discharged forms. "You're still here?" "I suppose I am. There's no record of you transferring." "I imagine the paperwork got lost," Elijah says softly. The officer squints. "You didn't fight?" "No," Elijah answers. "But I worked." The officer shrugs. "Guess it takes all kinds." He signs Elijah's discharge and says, "You'll be home by week's end." That night, Elijah stays up late. He finishes one last journal entry. April 5th, 10th. He doesn't sleep much. His mother has passed. The house is empty. The wheat fields are bare. By dawn, he's walking the edge of camp, tracing the old goat trail one more time. His boots crunch on frostbitten grass, and that's it. No farewell ceremony. Just a man with calloused fingers and the quiet satisfaction of a job done well of vain. If no one noticed, when he returns home, there's no one to greet him. He unpacks slowly. Tea again, steeped just right. Years later, his name is found in the footnotes of a supply report. Listed only once. Private Elijah Harper. Detail. Non-combat support. Function. Camp logistics. But in his journals, which would one day be found wrapped in twine inside a cedar chest. Still, one must wonder, if a soldier never enters battle, never fires a weapon, and never raises his voice, did he serve? Or did he simply endure? Elijah Harper's story doesn't end with cannon fire or triumph. It ends the way it begun, quietly, with measured movements and the steady scratching of pen on paper. After the war, he didn't speak much about his service. When asked, he would smile faintly and say, "I saw a great deal, but not what you'd think." But the hearth still stood, and the kettle hook still swung above it. Took down the old curtains and stitched them into new pillowcases, just as his mother had once done for him. Most people didn't press further. The war had scattered families. Some never returned. But word traveled that Elijah Harper had come home, not as a hero, not as a veteran to be celebrated, just as himself. He returned to his family's empty farmhouse, now overgrown with goldenrod and crawling vines. The roof leaked. The barn was half collapsed. Boiled root vegetables for elderly men with no teeth. And when someone mentioned the war, Elijah listened carefully without interrupting. He wrote down recipes for pickled beets, notes on how to tell when a rain barrel needs cleaning. Once, a full page simply described the sound of a bird's wing against a window pane. Elijah cleaned slowly, methodically, repaired what he could, hauled fresh water. Neighbors were slow to reappear. He worked odd jobs, taught letters to children in a corner of the local church, read aloud two widows who'd lost their sons. He stitched his own socks until his eyes went too dim to thread the needle. The blacksmith came once a month for tea. A schoolgirl brought him a jar of apple butter in autumn, and a man, a veteran with a limp, came just once, handed him a letter, and said, "You stitched my uniform, saved my leg from freezing off." I never forgot. His journals filled slowly in those years, not with battles or bitterness, but with observations about soil, about wind, about the changing of the seasons. A cot without mildew, a cup without a crack, a man who had a coat to wear when the wind bit down. Time passed. The farmhouse weathered. Elijah's hair turned the color of soot. He listened well, and he made the best chicory tea in 3 counties. He kept a log of visitors. It wasn't long. Some carry string and silence. Elijah thanked him, offered tea, and said nothing more. In 1901, when he was in his late 50s, a historian compiling a regional account of the war came asking about his journals. "You never fought?" the man asked. "For the coat stitched and the letters written, for the campfire stoked and the men who didn't shiver, because someone remembered to check the blanket pile." "No," Elijah said. "You never even saw combat." "I saw consequences," Elijah answered softly. "Every day." The historian left puzzled, with a handful of carpet entries, mostly about oats and bandage supplies. He didn't understand. Most didn't. But Elijah was never trying to be understood. He just wanted things to be in their right place. When Elijah passed peacefully by the hearth, with his boots neatly beside his chair, the local minister spoke only a few words. He wrote things down. That was enough. His journals remained on the shelf. One of them bore a faint inscription on the inside cover. "Not every soldier needs a sword." And so, we remember Elijah Harper not for what he fought, but for what he fixed. In the end, history often tells us who led the charge. But who remembers the one who boiled the water? Who stitched the holes? Who counted the boots twice? Now, as the candle flickers low and the story rests beneath a soft quilt asleep, ask yourself gently, is war only what happens on the battlefield? Or is it also the quiet war of care, of patience, of holding things together while the world falls apart? Good evening, friend. Tonight, we turn to one of history's quietest causes of chaos, not swords, not speeches, but scribes. Specifically, the small, sleepy mistakes that changed entire empires. And if this gentle detour into dusty records helps you relax, feel free to tap like or subscribe only. If it feels right, a misplaced name, a misread date, a smeared ink blot. His name is Otto. He is 23, pale with exhaustion, and using his 3rd quill of the morning. Snow clings to the inside of the window. Slats. The ink pot is half frozen, not a king's name, and the von Selsen family, who argued that Frederick was their rightful claimant. A typo triggered not only a property dispute, but to generations of legal wrangling, one fatal duel, and eventually a redrawing of territorial lines inside, all from a tired clerk and a frozen inkwell. A clerk's. One of them, a gouch-ridden old man with stiff fingers, mistakenly enters Baron Gilbert de Clare's death date as occurring a week earlier than it actually did. But Otto, blinking through the sting of cold, writes Frederick, just one letter off. They may not seem like much, but in the right place, at the wrong time. They shifted borders, erased lineages, and rewrote the fate of dynasties. So dim your lights. Let the hush of paper and candlelight settle in. The property was never returned to his widow. She sued the crown, on and off, for the next 15 years. Now let's begin with a name. In a small village near present-day Hebei province, a local headman tallies his census forms for submission. The year is 1432. A slip of the brush just a dash to Shalokas as a 7, to be recorded as a 1, with the population dramatically underreported. They're taxed as a small holding. Local officials, unaware of the error, place higher burdens on neighboring villages to balance the numbers. The year is 1547. In the flickering torchlight of the Holy Roman Empire's chancery, a young clerk bends over a sheaf of parchment. He's copying a land grant. Let's explore a few more. The internal migration causes a labor shortage in the East and sparks rumors of favoritism and corruption in the tax office. His successor, the records show, had no letterless and illiterate man appointed, not for merit, but for loyalty to the emperor. Distracted by noise outside or perhaps rushing to finish before nightfall, he writes Dufresne instead of Dufresne in the Grumest family name. By the time Gilbert, very much alive, rode into London in a fury to dispute the claim, the writs had already been issued. The noble beneficiary is supposed to be Friedrich von Sels. But for every monumental act, there are hundreds of overlooked moments when a quill, a blot, or a tired hand guided the course of nations. A small thing, harmless, perhaps, but this minor misspelling would later spark a decades-long feud between the von Sels. The world barely shifts but in the shadows of what might have been. You never knew. And that's the heart of tonight's story. These are the quiet cracks beneath history's marble floors. Fast forward to England, 1304. Court scribes are recording noble affairs in the king's chancery. The consequences, enormous. Upon reading the false death entry, the crown moved quickly to seize de Clare's extensive estates as was standard in disputed successions. And irony, with its impeccable timing, took the stage. Gilbert died actually, this time just 2 days later in a hunting accident. One incorrect date. Next, we cross continents to Ming Dynasty China. He lists 17 taxable males instead of 71. This single digit alters the village's obligations for decades. Food runs short. Resentment simmered. Families from the overburdened districts begin to migrate quietly at first, then en masse. Eventually, the regional governor is removed. And yet again, a single brushstroke changed the fates of thousands. Now let's visit revolutionary France. It's 1792, and a priest in a countryside parish is filling out a marriage register during a hectic wedding season. The mistake is minor. At the time, nobody notices, but 2 generations later, when a descendant attempts to claim inheritance from a dormant noble title, the documents don't match. The claim is denied. That man lives and dies as a baker. Had the record been correct, he would have inherited a vineyard, a house near Dijon, and a baronial title. A noble line quietly ends. A new life quietly begins. History tends to remember kings, wars, and declarations. It's tempting to believe that history moves in deliberate strokes, but so often it's smeared in the margins. Let's pause here for now. Ask yourself this, before we drift into section 2. If one wrong name can undo a lineage, how many others have slipped through the cracks, never corrected, and never remembered? Let us now walk further into this quiet parade of missteps, through halls lined not with banners, but with dusty filing cabinets and scrolled chests, each harboring forgotten forces disguised as paperwork. Picture Vienna, 1781. A royal decree is being copied in triplicate by hand in the Imperial Archive. The original order was carefully worded to reduce tariffs on grain, a crucial move to prevent bread riots. Instead of farmers reaping profits from wheat, distillers and smugglers begin thriving. Potato prices spike, grape harvests are diverted into brandy. Urban centers see a short-lived economic boom. The Treasury realizes it has undertaxed intoxicants for nearly 2 years. But in a single moment of carelessness, the underpaid junior archivist, whose spectacles are fogged from the morning frost, miscopies the term as grain spirits. A single word changes everything. By the time the decree is circulated, alcohol imports surge. By the time the mistake is discovered, it's politically impossible to reverse. A conclave of cardinals meets to decide the rightful pontiff. The vote is a miscopied noun had rewritten the diet, economy, and public behavior of an entire region. Let's move west to the papal conclave of 1411. Instead of 23 votes, the candidate receives 22 on the scroll. That would be preserved for record. It's a time of political tension, with multiple popes vying for authority. One afternoon, with a quill that kept splattering and a wrist stiff from cold, he copied the name of the wrong village into the exemption list, a marginal note in a Vatican ledger. Scribbled decades later, one secretarial writing in cramped Latin by lamplight marks the tally wrong. For 30 years, they thrived until a visiting official noticed the discrepancy. A formal inquiry followed. Angry letters were exchanged. Accusations of favoritism bloomed. No one notices in time. Another candidate is declared pope. The ripple effects are staggering. A 3-year schism splits loyalties across Europe. Dozens of bishops switch allegiance. One region refuses to follow any pope at all. Just a quiet nod to a man who accidentally redrew an entire district's fortune. The rightful candidate whose vote was truly the majority returns quietly to his he dies there, a decade later, unrecognized. His only footnote in history. Perhaps he was the true pope. The math is unclear. Now we turn to the Ottoman Empire. In the 17th century, a scribe named Hamid was responsible for transcribing tax exemptions from a region in Anatolia. The intended village, burdened and poor, was taxed as normal. A wrong name here, a number misplaced there. But the accidentally exempted village located just a few valleys away. They wrote the truth, as the world would later believe it. Because while laws can be repealed, an error written and filed often lives unchallenged, especially when no one remembers what the truth was meant to be. While others sold livestock to meet quotas, this community invested in new wells, expanded fields, and even built a small school. What began as an ink smear led to the reassignment of several tax officers, an economic audit of 3, and eventual reforms that rewrote how the empire recorded village boundaries. And Hamid, his name appears once in a line scrawled in the margin of the investigation log. Possibly a copying error. No ill intent suspect, no blame, no glory. These errors, though small in shape, were immense in effect. But their danger was not in what they did, it was in how silently they did it. No speeches marked their arrival. No bells rang when they took root. They simply slipped in, unnoticed. And what of legacy? When we picture power, we rarely imagine the scribe. Yet they sat closest to the throne. They held the wax seal. In a strange way, their mistakes held more permanence than many laws. We'll pause here, in this soft twilight of ink and parchment. But ask yourself, if these small mistakes shaped empires, how many more linger quietly in our own records unnoticed, uncorrected, and still unfolding their consequences? Now, imagine Canterbury, 11th century. A Benedictine monk by the name of Brother Untold sits hunched in a candlelit scriptorium. His fingers are ink-stained, his back curved like a half-drawn bow. He's copying a local chronicle onto parchment. The fire crackles low. Outside, frost builds on the abbey windows without omission. Her claim disappears from the record. Historians centuries later debate why the daughter is never mentioned again. The answer is not betrayal, not conspiracy, just a draft, a candle, a sneeze. Chimeres dies in childbirth, and her children grow up unaware they were ever heirs. Halfway down a page, Untold, distracted by a novice sneezing behind him, skips a line, the missing line, a sentence, describing the transfer of land from a minor nobleman to his daughter. By the 13th century, the estate is thought to have always belonged to another branch of the family. Untold, no villain, simply tired. That night, in a damp cabin rocked by ocean swell, he records his ship's coordinates in the logbook. His hands tremble. He mistakenly reverses the latitude and longitude values for a reef in the coral sea. Jump forward now to the year 1767. It's a routine task, the kind done hundreds of times a month. But the clerk mishears the surname, scribbles Weiland instead of Weiler. Johann Weiland is found to have no legal link to the Weiler estate. The case is dismissed. The man lives and dies a local carpenter. Years later, his press begins to publish revolutionary pamphlets during the 1848 uprisings in the German states, pamphlets that stir students, thinkers, and unionists to rise against monarchic rule. A British naval officer, Lieutenant Hugh Weathers, is sick with fever aboard a merchant vessel. On board are crates of French silk, Persian dyes, and diplomatic letters intended for a British colony in India. The entry is transcribed into navigational charts used across the British Navy. 18 years later, in 1785, a merchant ship trusting those same charts runs aground and sinks. A blurred initial in a baptismal record leads to the wrong child being raised as heir. A scribe abbreviates a town name, and centuries later, archaeologists dig in the wrong place. The incident sparks a diplomatic flare-up between France and Britain, both already tense after earlier trade disputes. A naval apology is drafted but never fully accepted. A page turned too quickly. A tally mark was added where none belong. One sailor's fever. One transposed number. And across empires, an alliance quietly shifts, now to 19th century Bavaria. A civil registrar in the town of Augsburg is processing a birth certificate for a newborn named Yo. The error goes unnoticed. Decades later, an inheritance case is opened. But here's where it loops strangely. With no inheritance, Johann opens a printing shop. A family fortune diverted. A printer born by accident. And a revolution fed by ink that was never meant to be spilled. These are the echoes that clerical errors create. They do not roar. They ripple. A missed comma in a treaty changes a boundary line. Even the grandest dynasties may rest upon a ledger written by someone with cold hands, a splitting headache, and an inkpot to dry. So what do we learn? That history is not only made by generals or kings, but by the small moments no one applauds. It's humbling, isn't it? We like to believe in purpose, in deliberate design, but often the fates of nations rest in the margin of a clerk's bad handwriting. So as we close the parchment on this chapter, may we carry that truth softly with us, that even the smallest strokes of ink may carry the weight of empires. Good evening again, friend. Tonight, we leave behind thrones and inkpots and descend into a far darker place, beneath the elegance of 19th century Paris, but not into mystery or romance. No, this journey takes us into the sewers, into the tunnels, where unseen laborers carve the very arteries of a growing city. Unknowingly, set the stage for one of the deadliest epidemics Europe would face. Dim your lights, settle back, let the hush of stone tunnels and dripping echoes carry your thoughts downward. This is the story of the Suadigas of Parasan, with nearly 1 million people now calling the city home. The infrastructure, most of it medieval, was straining at every joint. Refuse from homes, butcheries, and street markets poured into gutters that led directly to the Seine, the river. once a symbol of life, became a ribbon of disease. It begins with growth. By the 1830s, Paris was choking on its own success. It smelled foul. But more than that, it was deadly. To combat the decay, the government hired teams of workers to expand the underground sewer system. They were not city planners. Most were laborers, former coal miners, or desperate men with nowhere else to go. They were known simply as less sewer men, armed with shovels, pickaxes, and oil lanterns. They ventured into the shadow world, below Paris. Brick by brick, they dug tunnels in silence, guided only by memory, damp maps, and the sound of trickling waste. Then the vomit. Corpses piled up in courtyards. Public fountains were shut. The water, not the air, was the killer. Priests worked overtime. The rich fled the city. The poor, unable to escape, waited. Then death. Their boots were always wet. Their hands never truly clean. The air was thick with ammonia and methane. The sewer men soaked cloth in vinegar to cover their mouths. Even so, most would leave every shift. Conditions were, in a word, medieval. Many fell ill. Few were ever named. But in their narrow tunnels, they tried to contain a crisis they didn't fully understand. The tunnel's narrow, arched passages of brick and stone were built just wide enough for a wheelbarrow or a hunched man. The air is warm but stale. A drip echoes behind you. Somewhere, a lantern flickers, found slumped against the bricks, his lantern still lit. They were proud men, in a quiet way. No one noticed them, but, without their labor, the city would drown. One not of armies, but of laborers, against rot, brick against decay. But they kept working. Some of them slept in shacks, near the entrances. Others trudged through cold streets at dawn, tools slung over their backs like soldiers. And then cholera came. It arrived in 1832, like a ghost. No one knew how. No one knew why. At first, it was just stomach pains. Entire neighborhoods emptied within days. The government blamed bad air. Miasmas rising from stagnant alleys. But some noticed a pattern. The worst outbreaks occurred near river drawpoints and sewer outlets. And yet, the digging continued. The work through it all, navigating the disease's very veins. One worker, Jules Lenoir, remembered only through a single newspaper entry from 1833. A man of the sewers, aged 29, died in his post. That's all. No epitaph, no monument. But his death and others, like it was part of a quiet, invisible war. And though cholera would return again and again, it was their slow, grim work that laid the foundation for a healthier city. Let's stop here. In the tunnels, let the darkness settle. And as you rest in that space, consider this. If the health of a city rests on its sewers, who deserves more? Honor the men above, or the men below. Let's continue deeper now, not just into the tunnels beneath Paris, but into the quieter truths that seep through brickwork and bureaucracy alike. By mid-1832, cholera had claimed tens of thousands in the city. Death came so swiftly that public carts normally used to carry trechoir, repurposed for citizens stuffed lavender in their kerchiefs to block the stench. Entire neighborhoods wore black. No one called them heroes. But if they stopped, the streets above would overflow. But beneath the panic, the sewer diggers kept working. No one celebrated them. One of the engineers, Pierre Simon Gerard, noted in his journal, "They labor like ghosts in reverse. Instead of haunting us, they carry the city's sin away." Which passage echoed too much warning of unstable bricks or rising gas. The Paris sewer system at the time was a strange hybrid, part medieval ditchwork, part Enlightenment era design. These names never appeared on official maps, but among the diggers they were gospel. Some tunnels still followed paths laid down in the 1200s. Others were newly lined with brick and designed to separate stormwater from waste-o. In practice, they rarely did. At street level, the elegant boulevards of the Marais and Latin Quarter had facades of civility, but underneath, a labyrinth of rot and runoff. One brick at a time, and those who ventured below knew every inch. They could tell you which tunnel dipped too low in the spring, which corner never fully drained. The tools were few: iron bars, buckets, and oil lamps. Some brought whistles, hoping the echoes might carry if they were buried. A few scrawled their names onto bricks before sealing off old tunnels, in case someone ever returned. But beneath all that, he also ordered one of the most ambitious sewer expansions in the world. Many wore leather aprons, and wooden clogs sometimes soaked through before lunch. Some workers began to name parts of the sewer like towns: La Chambre, Freud, Rusamba, the Boiling Elbow. Reports from diggers were taken more seriously. Maps were redrawn. He was 46, had been digging since he was 17. When asked what kept him in the tunnels, he replied, new construction was proposed not above ground, but below. That's farther than the length of France from north to south. The men who had once worked in the dark, now finally pulling the city into the light. By 1840, as Paris reeled from more outbreaks, a silent shift began. City planners, many of whom had once ignored the underground, started listening. In their own quiet way, the sewer workers had become experts, without degrees, without uniform, just calloused hands and lived knowledge. One man, Benoit Marchand, was interviewed by a reformist newspaper. When I'm down there, I know the city's worst parts, but I also know they can be moved. Their lives recorded only in wage books and death notices, and yet it was dangerous work. Gas pockets ignited, collapsed beams crushed men silently, and cholera wasn't the only threat. Typhoid, dysentery, and trench fever all lurked in stagnant pools. Still, they dug. There are records of diggers who went blind from gas, of others who refused promotions because they didn't want to leave the tunnels. The 1850s brought change. Baron Haussmann, commissioned by Napoleon III, redesigned much of Paris. He's remembered for boulevards, grand facades, and city parks. Guess who laid the brick? It was the same men, only now they were joined by engineers and architects who mapped the tunnels, not just as drainage but as organs of the city. By the time the work was done, the Paris sewers stretched for over 600 kilometers, and at the heart of it all, but still, few names survived. They weren't listed in their journals, if any existed, were lost. One newspaper, writing decades later, said, "We remember the generals of war, but rarely the quiet soldiers who battled the seas with nothing but bricks and bread." Let's pause again. In the flickering light, you're standing in the cool air of a dry tunnel now. It smells of damp stone, rust, and something older. In this moment of silence, one question remains. When a city survives, who really saved it? The ones who ruled it, or the ones who scraped its floors clean? Now, let's rise slowly toward the final stretch of this story, not into daylight, but toward recognition. Because while Paris's elegant facades eventually gleamed, and its fountains once again flowed, the names of the sewer diggers faded into the damp brick behind them. Yet their legacy didn't stop with cholera. The work they did beneath the city would ripple far beyond the tunnels themselves into urban planning, public health, and how we think about the hidden systems that keep life running. By the late 19th century, the Paris sewers were no longer just a haphazard collection of underground ditches. How a poorly placed grate could backflow into a bakery. How even a well-placed drain meant nothing if the brickwork upstream was lazy. They had become the blueprint for modern sanitation infrastructure across the world. These men know their city better than any mayor. City after city, London, New York, Vienna sent engineers to study the Parisian system. But when those foreign officials arrived, they didn't meet Baron Haussmann. They met the sewer men. It wasn't glamorous, even when it was noble. Rough-spoken, quick with their tools, and deeply proud. They walked diplomats through the muck and explained, without fanfare, how a misaligned pipe could flood a street. One British visitor in 1871 wrote in his journal, "Never have I seen such knowledge carried so humbly." But if you listen closely beyond the buzz of fluorescent lights, you might still feel the presence of lanterns, boots, and breath in the walls. Each time, the diggers were there, patching, clearing, strengthening the arteries of the city's underbelly. And still, when the diplomats left, the diggers went back to work. Quietly, thoroughly. As always, the Paris cholera outbreaks returned, though less frequently and with diminishing force. Their brick linings still bear faint initials carved in soft clay before it dried. The letters are hard to see now, but they're there. Little signatures left behind by men who knew they'd never be remembered in marble. They never had medals, but they had a strange kind of camaraderie. A fraternity of the damp. Their children rarely followed in their footsteps, and yet they left something permanent. They didn't know their efforts would help shift how cities are built, or how governments respond to pandemics. In modern Paris, some of the sewer tunnels still in use trace their original 19th century paths. Tourists can now visit a portion of the Paris sewers the day egouts. It's tidy, well-lit, and dry. The walls have informational plaques and safety railing. The museum displays the names of a few prominent engineers. But near the exit, in a quiet corner, there's a brass plaque that reads, "To the anonymous diggers, who worked in shadow and gave the city light." That might be the most accurate line of the entire tour. So as we close this story, let us reflect not on disease or even labor, but on the quiet architecture of survival. Because beneath every thriving city, there are unsung systems and unsung hands. The sewer diggers of Paris didn't know they were laying the groundwork for modern sanitation, but their work rippled forward. Every flush, every drain, every dry basement owes them something, even if we forget their names. Good evening once more, friend. Tonight, we drift into a very different kind of silence. The one you find when standing in a long line, in the cold, in a country shifting on its axis. It is 1921. And Russia's still shivering from revolution. Picture a snow-dusted city street. A queue of people wraps around a gray, crumbling building. Some lean against crutches. Some hold tin pails. Others have nothing but a small cloth bag and hope. The Tsars are gone. Lenin is alive, but frail. The Red Army has triumphed. Currency was nearly meaningless, and bread was traded like gold. But victory, as you'll see, doesn't fill your stomach. Let your breath settle. This is not a battlefield. It's a lunch line. But the distribution of rations was uneven and erratic. Soldiers were prioritized. Factory workers in key industries received extra bread. But elderly people, students, former nobility, and intellectuals often got almost nothing. A line for potatoes. Russia after the revolution was not the idealized workers' utopia promised in propaganda posters. By the time we reached the front, only one bag remained. The boy in front of me took it. I returned home and boiled my boots. In cities like Petrograd and Moscow, food had grown scarce. Trains had stopped. Farms had collapsed. Boiling leather was a last resort. There was protein in the glue, after all. A pile of burlap sacks in one corner. A clerk behind a battered desk, keeping track with pencil stubs and hand-cranked and in the middle of this scarcity, the potato, a starchy, humble root, became a lifeline. Not golden, not fresh, often speckled with rot or green skin. But they were food, sort of, just small ones, shared under breath, in frost. The queues for food began forming before sunrise. You were often handed a numbered token, just to preserve order. Others just stared ahead, shoes frozen to the ground, thinking of stew and how to stretch them across 3 days with broth made from crushed bones. If you lost that slip of paper, you could lose your meal. Fights broke out when people cut in line, and sometimes, when the doors opened, there would be nothing left. One woman in line might pull a shawl tighter around a child. Another might offer a crust of yesterday's ration to an elderly man behind her. Yet people waited, because there was nothing else to do. You might see a former ballerina, still in her moth-eaten scarf, standing behind a duck, or a philosophy professor, once well-fed on imperial honoraria, now trading his pocket watch for 2 bruised tubers. The average citizen in Lenin's Russia survived on ration cards. The potato line was where those lines blurred. It was democracy of desperation. There's a diary entry from a woman named Zenita G. a nurse in Moscow in 1921. Today I stood 5 hours for potatoes. We were 26th in line. That was not a joke. And still, they waited every morning because the line, however slow and cold, was a thread of hope. The stores were often not stores at all. They were repurposed buildings, former churches, government offices, even stables converted into food stations. The interiors were bare, sometimes no shelves at all. And always behind the clerk were the sacks of potatoes. People learned tricks. How to scrape off the worst parts, how to stew them with bits of onion peel. But beyond the food itself, the line became a kind of community. People whispered news rumors of foreign aid, gossip about Lenin's health, and word of grain arriving from the countryside. These were not loud acts. Sometimes people brought books to read while they waited. The Soviet system called this progress plan distribution, fair and scientific, but to those in line, it often just felt like standing still. Let's pause here. In the quiet of the queue, the snow is falling again. Your hands are red with cold, but your number hasn't been called yet. And so you wait and wonder, in a system designed to lift the people, how many were simply left standing? Let's continue now. Standing quietly in that frozen line in 1921, you shuffle your feet. Your breath makes small clouds. The person ahead of you coughs a dry, persistent sound that disappears into the snowy hush of the morning. The line inches forward, but no one speaks much, because this isn't a place for talking. It's a place for enduring. Grain from Ukraine. Once the empire's breadbasket was requisitioned by the state and often spoiled before it reached the cities. During this time, hunger wasn't just an inconvenience to the people. It was an ache in the bones. It was a political force. You could tell how bad things were by how early people lined up, by how many children they brought. By then, many elderly simply stopped showing up. The Bolsheviks had seized power with promises of bread and land, but the civil war that followed left fields untended, railways broken, and entire provinces isolated. Sometimes party officials would show up to inspect the queue, asking questions about where people were from, what they were doing before the revolution, and whether they were former class enemies to the government. Hunger was a statistic. The line for potatoes became a kind of unofficial census. A longer line didn't mean more food. It meant more desperation. The truly prepared had tin pails with rope handles for carrying their prize home without spilling it into the slush. But here's the quiet truth. The line wasn't just a place to wait. It became a form of silent protest, even if they couldn't count on food at the end. 4 hours. Peasants could sell surplus grain on the open market. Small businesses reopened. A trickle of foreign food aid arrived. Every day, people didn't chant slogans or raise banners. They simply stood. These were often young boys, no older than 12, wearing coats 3 sizes too big, because in Soviet Russia, rumors and official notices were equally unreliable. The line was real. It was visible. It was something you could cling to, even if it didn't deliver. They'd slip into the line at dawn and wait until mid, then hand off their spot in exchange for a boiled egg or, if they were lucky, a piece of hard sugar. And that quiet refusal to give up sent its own message, a ritual, a strange kind of hope. The authorities noticed a wrong answer could mean your ration card was revoked, so people learned to speak carefully or not at all. Still measuring, still checking papers. At least then, you're not alone. Still, the line persisted. There were some who made a living from it, line holders, who were paid in cigarettes or scraps of soap to stand for the elderly, or others brought small folding stools or old rugs to wrap around their boots. It wasn't efficient, but it worked in its own way, because for all its dysfunction, the potato line was something people could count on. And then came the NEP Lenin's new economic policy. In 1921, desperate to stave off complete collapse, the Soviet government relaxed some of its strict controls, and the lines, for a time, shortened. Some days, the potato line moved quickly. Some days, the sacks at the end were fuller, the eyes of the workers brighter, but the memory of hunger lingered. Many continued to wait in line even when food was rumored to be available elsewhere. It became a habit. There's a saying from this time: if you don't know what to do, stand in a line, because no matter how bleak things became, the line reminded people they were still trying, still surviving, still human. And in a world full of uncertainty, that meant something. Let's pause again here, near the front of the line. The clerk is behind the desk. You can almost smell the starch of the potato, but they're still counting sacks. You grip your tin pail a little tighter, and as the cold settles in your coat, you wonder. In a system where equality meant waiting, was standing quietly the most radical thing you could do. Now, we find ourselves at the front of the line, after hours in the cold, after whispered rumors and hopeful glances, after shifting from one foot to another until your legs hum with fatigue. Inside the small, dim-lit room, the air is warmer. Damp coats steam faintly. The clerk behind the desk looks as tired as you feel. He says nothing, just gesture to the next sack. You step forward. Inside it, potatoes, wrinkled, spotted, heavy with damp soil, but food. You take your portion, not by weight, but by handful. There is no scale, just trust, or the closest thing to it. You nod, and he nods back. Undramatic, no music swells, no flags wave, just a simple exchange of need and supply. It's a quiet moment, and yet, for many, this was the most important moment of the day. The hunger was not forgotten, but now it had met its answer, if only briefly. The line itself had worn them down, but getting the potato stat made the waiting real. This wasn't about fullness. It was about relief, about surviving one more night, maybe feeding a child, maybe making enough broth to stretch too. They reformed the next day, sometimes in the same spot, sometimes in front of a new supply post. But the ritual remained, and for those still waiting in line outside, the cycle continued. Lines in Soviet Russia didn't disappear with one meal. It became symbolic, not only of scarcity, but of silent end. Even as the NEP slowly improved conditions, and more food began to appear in markets, the culture of standing in line endured. It became a fixture of Soviet life, a shape etched into daily routine. Like waiting, even when hope was thin. By the late 1920s, with Stalin consolidating power, the NEP was scrapped, and in stories passed down by those who stood through winters with nothing but a tin pail and patience. Men with caps pulled low. You don't see anger, symbol. There's no celebration. But tonight, at least, you'll have something warm to eat. Still breathing, still waiting for things to get better. Anchor or rebellion. Just be quiet. Private markets were shut again. Food once more became scarce. New waves of famine followed. The potato lines came back. Now, joined by bread lines, meat lines, and milk lines. In many ways, that original 1921 line never ended. It just changed shape. There are black and white photos from this era. Grainy, but telling a line of bundled figures, backs, bent, children clinging to mothers. And that quiet might be the most haunting thing. A Soviet joke from the 1930s captured it well. We pretend to work. They pretend to pay us. We pretend there's food. They pretend we're fed. But jokes weren't just for laughter. They were survival, too. Like stew made from nothing. Today, those lines are gone. But the legacy of that era lingers in memory, in diaries, and in faded ration books tucked in museum drawers. The humble potato became more than food. It became currency. It meant you were still part of something. And so, as we leave this chapter, take one last look at the line. It's snowing again. You step away, sack in hand. Your boots crunch softly as you walk toward home. And that, in its own way, was enough. Good evening, friend. Tonight's story drifts far from trenches, speeches, and uniforms. Instead, we'll flip through something quieter, something ordinary. A small stack of postcards faded, foxed with age, and nearly forgotten. Each one was once a message, a snapshot, a hello from a train stop or a mountaintop. But they came from a time and place where nothing was innocent. Let us journey to Nazi Germanenot, through a soldier-esque march or a dictator-esque rally, but through the eyes of tourists. Yes, there were tourists. Dim your light. Imagine the flick of postage stamps and the scratch of fountain pens. Saw the opera. Heading to Berchtesgaden next. We begin with a card from Munich, dated 1937. It shows a blooming garden, swans on a lake, and the words in careful script, "Wishing you were here, weather perfect." Foreigners came. So did citizens from other parts of the Reich, taking summer trips with discounted rail tickets. And nothing about the Jewish shops that had vanished, or the bookshops are now full of one voice. This is a story of what people chose to write down, what they left out. In the late 1930s, before the war exploded across Europe, Germany saw a tourism boom. The regime wanted it that way. Cities were cleaned, trains were punctual, and the Nazi Party published glossy brochures showing mountains, lakes, and smiling children in traditional dress. For the postcard writer, it all seemed charming if you didn't look too closely. Classical concerts are played in halls with polished wood. Trains whisked travelers through the Black Forest. At souvenir stands, postcards were stacked in tidy rotating racks and sets. Castles, cheerful farm scenes, even little cartoons, or the hush that fell when police walked by. So you said nothing, or said what they wanted you to. And behind it all, silence. Postcards, you see, tell us more than travel guides ever could. What they thought was safe to say. They show what people choose to remember. Most German postcards from 1935 to 1939 say things like, "Not allowed," "Not on paper," "Hiking to damn it." The nicest couple from Dresden, tell them I saw one just like this. "The sausages here are better than back home. This village is so clean and the children so polite." You'll rarely read about the signs on Jewish homes, or the fear in some shopkeeper's eyes. Smell the old ink. Hear the careful cheer in every sentence. It's not just omission, it's protection. Postcards were censored. You knew someone might read them, and then you licked the stamp and moved on. A woman named Martha H., visiting from Stuttgart in 1936, wrote to a sister from the Bavarian Alps, "The air here is clearer than anywhere. I've never felt so alive. It feels like the whole country is healing." She doesn't mention the construction camp a mile up the road, or the train car that passed them, covered in canvas, bound east. She wouldn't have asked about it. Instead, she sketched a cow in the corner of the card. "For a little Emil," she wrote. Let's pause here. Among the postcards, spread them on the table, and ask, in a country filled with fear, what does it mean to write, "Wish you were here"? Let's continue. Quietly flipping through those brittle cards, now we find ourselves in 1938, the year of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues across Germany were shattered. But if you search the postcards sent that week, you might never know what happened. One card, dated 2 days after the pogroms, reads, "The bells were ringing. It was very moving. Lights strung across every street. I bought gingerbread for the children. We visited Regensburg yesterday, toured the old cathedral." Another, from Nuremberg, says, "The Christmas market is beginning. No mention of broken windows or arrests. Just bells and gingerbread on one side. Tidy handwriting, smiling family photos, and landscapes drawn in watercolor pastels. On the other, erasure." That's the strange duality of postcards in Nazi Germany. Clean streets, healthy children, patriotic festivals. The message wasn't, "We control everything." It was, "Everything is fine." But this wasn't just a tactic of silence, it was a tool of illusion. The Nazi regime understood the power of aesthetics. They didn't want to look like a dictatorship. They wanted to feel like a postcard. They weren't propaganda posters too obvious. They were personal, and therefore even more persuasive. Postcards helped sell that message. Foreign tourists were especially targeted. Tourists wrote home about how modern and friendly Germany was. Some even praised the orderliness. In a lead-up to the 1936 Olympics, the streets of Berlin were scrubbed, spotless. Anti-Jewish signs were temporarily removed. There's a card from a British couple visiting Berlin in July 1936. Quite thorough here. We toured the Tiergarten, stopped for strudel, and even saw realize such passion and unity. Not a single beggar to be seen. Street performers and disabled veterans were pushed out of sight. The city was curated, like a stage. That was no accident. The risk of saying the wrong thing increased as surveillance tightened. People stopped mentioning politics altogether. Homeless people had been rounded up weeks before, and the postcards were the curtain call. Some postcards did hint at any's butt, always between the lines. One man, writing from Hamburg, noted, "The hotel is lovely, though our hosts seem careful." Another wrote, "Had to show our papers 3 times today, to hear the silence, to feel the tension beneath the polite script. They never said more. Perhaps they didn't know more. Or perhaps they didn't dare." Back inside Germany, among its own citizens, postcards became even more subdued. Instead, the cards became exercises in vagueness. Weather is holding. The card feels smooth from years of hands. The message says nothing alarming. Just a note about a lake or a cafe. No news. All is as before. "Tell mother I am well. Do not worry." These weren't just messages, they were codes. To receive such a card was to read between the lines. It's strange how much can be said by not saying. In archives today, historians study these postcards not for what they reveal, but for what they carefully avoid. Whole exhibitions have been mounted walls lined with beige rectangles, looping cursive, and stamps with swastikas in the corners. They are quiet things, but powerful. One curator described them as smiling masks worn by paper. They remind us that history is not always shouted. Sometimes it's whispered in ink. Let's pause again. You're holding one now, and yet your fingers sense something else. A question still lingers. In a world carefully curated by power, what truths can still be mailed? In plain sight, the date is early 1939. War is close. You can feel it in the tones. Slightly more hurried, slightly more strained, but still, the card smiles. It's a watercolor of the Zugspitze, Germany's tallest mountain, snow-dusted peaks, a red-cheeked skier waves at the viewer. The message, hoping to come again next year. The food here is hearty, and the air is so clean. We're quite refreshed. It would be the last postcard they ever sent from Germany, because by the autumn, trains no longer carried tourists. They carried soldiers. They were relics of ordinary people who had visited extraordinary places at extraordinary times, said nothing. And others, to those who never had the chance to write postcards at all. After the war, most of these postcards were tossed away, stacks of them, buried in drawers or forgotten in attics. And yet, precisely because they said nothing, they became something else. Artifacts of complicity, of denial, of selective memory. One historian referred to them as paper ghosts, silent, smiling fragments of a nation mid-collapse. But some were saved. She had written them to his sister every summer 1934 to 1939. Neatly filed, one per year. Most of them showed tourist spots, lakes, gardens, markets. In 1993, a German school teacher named Ulrich. But on the back of a 1938 card from Vienna, there was one unusual line. "The synagogue is gone." No one speaks of it. By the time the reader held it, the moment was already gone. That was all. What they thought was safe to share. What they chose to remember or forget. Vintage, something for collectors. No commentary, no outrage. Just an observation. But that one sentence buried among the cheerful greetings pierced through the silence like a splinter. A crack in the mask. It now sits behind glass in a Berlin museum. Postcards often arrive days or weeks after they were written. And that S, what gives them their strange weight. They are snapshots of what people thought mattered in that moment. And years later, they become mirrors, not just of the places people visited, but of the truths they avoided. Today, we think of postcards as quaint, but these little rectangles once traveled through war zones, across censors' desks, through family kitchens, and into memory. They carried more than ink. They carried choices to write or to stay quiet, to mention the parador, the prisoner, to paint a smile or leave a blank. So as we set this final card back down, let it rest. Its picture has faded, its stamp curls at the corner, but its silence speaks volumes. And in that stillness, one final question lingers. When the world is watching, and no one says a word, is a postcard. Good evening, friend. Tonight, let's not sail across an ocean or march through a forest. Instead, let's open a cupboard, a very old one, tucked into a sagging wooden house on the edge of a clearing. The fire is out. The windows are boarded. The family is gone. But the pantry remains. And inside, clues, a jar of goose fat, a string of dried onions, half a candle, all left behind in a rush, or simply never used. Flour sacks. This is not a tale of Thanksgiving or pilgrims in tall hats. No feast, no turkey, just a quiet corner of early colonial life, preserved not in celebration but in absence. Most settlers live in cramped wooden homes with earthen floors, low ceilings, and drafty roofs. Winters are brutal. Summers are short. Food is survival, not ceremony. The year is 1627. Plymouth Colony is still young, and in one of those homes, a family vanished. Not mysteriously, but very ordinarily. They died, or moved, or were relocated. No names remain, only a household inventory, scrawled in black ink on brittle parchment. It reads like a shopping list, written backward. 2 pecks dried beans, 1 jug vinegar, salted cod tallow, 4 candles, cracked barrel rye, meal 1 tin of goose grease apron, stained. It's not poetic, but it's real. And in that list, we glimpse a life. The pantry, in colonial New England, was not a place of abundance. It was a strategy. A settler's survival depended on careful planning. Dry goods were stored in wooden crates or cloth sacks dyed with twine. The goose fat hints at rendering days when a single slaughtered bird was stretched for light, grease, and flavor. The spoiled vinegar, a failed batch come in. When temperatures shifted during fermentation, bread was often hard and sour, baked weeks in advance. The concept of fresh didn't exist, only still edible, and tucked high on shelves to keep away rats. Salt was gold, so was vinegar. Used to pickle whatever could be, and everything smelled. Damp wood, old cabbage, wet wool, and mildew. Most of the items had long rotted, but the impressions remained: rust rings from pots, salt stains, fragments of charred wood from shelves. Cleanliness wasn't optional, it was defensive. Someone had written it not as a record for others, but perhaps for themselves. A final stocktake. Before leaving, or dying, flour had to be sifted to remove weevils. Meat soaked in brine. That's what makes this pantry so fascinating. Nothing in it feels special, but every item had meaning. The cracked rye, Mealbarrel tells us, they ate coarse bread, and the apron, stained, perhaps from stewing beets, or blood from a dressed hare. Maybe just mud. It's all speculation, but grounded in ordinary survival. No myths, just crumbs. This abandoned pantry wasn't discovered recently. It was noted in an 1891 archaeological dig just outside Plymouth, and alongside them, that inventory list, preserved in a sealed jar under the floorboards. A pause, a reckoning. Let's pause there too. Feel the chill of that pantry, the dust, the stillness, and ask yourself, when a life ends, and all that's left is what they stored, what story does the cupboard tell? Let's step further into the pantry. You can almost hear the wooden floor groan beneath your boots. You duck slightly. These ceilings were built low to keep in the heat. The air smells of dried herbs and mouse droppings. It's quiet now. But once, this place was filled with motion. And they were also exhausted, underfed, and constantly calculating how many meals they had left. And hunger. We often imagine the first pilgrims as devout, serious folk, a whisper of failed gardens and too many mouths. Pantry management was more important than prayer. The list found beneath the floorboards reveals this unromantic truth. It's full of odds and ends. Dried legumes, rancid fats, spoiled yeast, a second sheet torn, and nearly illegible lists. Preserved roots, turnip, beet, parsnip. These weren't luxury. These were ballast against starvation. By comparing this pantry list with others recorded in surviving colonial wills, historians pieced together the rhythms of survival. For example, vinegar wasn't just for taste. It cleaned wounds, scrubbed pots, and preserved meat. Goose grease, aside from being a cooking fat, was rubbed on chapped hands and baby feet to prevent frostbite. Rye meal, coarse and difficult to digest, was often boiled into a sludge known as mush, eaten 3 times a day when wheat was unavailable. Perhaps their native neighbors no longer traded. No honey. Sweetness was rare save for the sick or special holidays. Its absence here isn't surprising. It's expected. Or perhaps they'd eaten the last of it weeks before. It was bitter. It was gritty. And it kept people alive. Even the items missing tell a story. Broken now, but once someone's only plate of beauty, it says, if we are gone, it will still keep. No corn, no sugar, and no spicy snot, even salt beyond what remained in cod brine. The family had, quite literally, boiled down to the basics. Still, there are tiny signs of care. Pressed into one corner of the shelf, archaeologists found a shriveled sprig of dried rosemary. Not enough for a roast, but perhaps kept for a smell or memory. A cracked dish near the hearth was painted with a faint blue line likely Delftware, imported. That matters. Even in the bleakest settings, people chose to keep one nice thing. The inventory ends with a note in a smaller hand, possibly the wife's, to be used after thaw. Scholars debate what it refers to. Maybe the meal barrel, maybe the last bit of lard, maybe a prayer, or maybe just hope, sealed in vinegar and soot. Let's pause again. Stand in that pantry, run your fingers along the rough shelf, feel the cold, and consider, if survival is measured not in years but in rations, how do we remember the ones who left behind only a list? Let's finish our walk through the pantry now. Slowly, as if we're afraid to disturb something sacred. Dust still clings to the low beams. A spiderweb dances near the hearth, catching bits of soot. Outside, the wind presses gently against the wooden slats. Inside, the air is still, not with reverence, but with forgetting. But in this stillness, there is a story. What we call the pantry was, for these settlers, more than a place of storage. It was their calculation of risk, their calendar of hunger. They didn't stockpile out of comfort. They did it out of fear. The twist of dried thyme hung not for flavor, but to keep flies away. And yet, even within those grim necessities, there were small rituals repeated across seasons. Several homes were vacated, some by death, others by resettlement or consolidation. The pantry we've explored likely belonged to one of those abandoned homes. The last beetroot pickled before frost. The pot of mush was left warm beside a bed during a fever. It was not romance, but it was care. By 1628, the Plymouth colony faced yet another brutal winter, and then something rare happened. The door latched. No scavenging, no looting, just quiet preservation. A neighbor, perhaps. A friend sealed its contents, long enough for us to read the lists, brush dust from the shelves, and wonder what meals were never eaten. The floorboards were nailed shut. Why? Perhaps out of respect. These were the relics of a people who measured life, not in days, but in scoops, or superstition, or hope that someone, someday, might return. That gesture, simple as it was, meant the pantry survived long enough to be found centuries later. The modern world is loud, fast, flooded with choice. But here, in this forgotten pantry, we see a different kind of richness. Not of abundance, but of resilience. A half-used candle, a chipped ladle, a smear of dried lard, and survived until they didn't. There's a quiet reverence in imagining that final moment. A woman is counting beans. A man is salting the last slab of fish. A child sitting cross-legged, waiting. Then silence. That's what makes this story linger, not tragedy, not glory, but quiet evidence. Notebooks with numbers, stains in wood, a list written without flourish. And yet, through it all, something very human. The desire to leave order behind, even at the end. So as we gently close the pantry door, we hear it creak shut behind us. Leave the dust, leave the jars, leave the list. And as you step out into the frostbitten wind of early colonial America, ask, in a world built on survival, is a pantry the most honest kind of monument? Good evening, friend. Tonight, we don't walk through grand halls as royalty. We sweep them, quietly, at dawn. This isn't a story about Marie Antoinette or Louis XVI, the one who stayed behind as the monarchy collapsed around him. It's about the man who polished the floors where they walked, who scrubbed soot from their fireplaces, who changed the chamber pots before the ministers arrived. This is the story of the janitor at Versailles during the Revolution. A man of no name in most records, but present always, in the background. Let's begin. Versailles in 1789 was still magnificent, but no longer sacred. The court had begun to decay from within. Just that. The palace kept a small staff as funds dwindled. The number of housemaids dropped. Guards rotated out. But the cleaning staff, those who knew the pipes, the floors, and the drafty window stay, were harder to replace. While powdered wigs and velvet coats still glided through the galleries, there were whispers in the shadows. Whispers of Paris, of hunger, of change. And in those early mornings, before the sun struck the gold-trimmed windows, the janitor worked. His uniform was a plain smock, stained from wax and oil and old plaster dust. He carried a tin bucket with a cracked wooden handle. He used a horsehair broom, worn at the bristles. He began in the Queen's antechamber, where perfume once overpowered the scent of sweat. He swept. We know almost nothing about him, officially. He washed away the stains left by spilled wine and long-removed portraits. Gone were the endless balls and court musicians. Gone was the smell of roasting game. Instead of coast dust, the chill of uncertainty. And this man, it seems, stayed. He polished the marble stairs, even as the footfalls of courtiers grew nearer. Perhaps because he had nowhere else to go. Perhaps because he didn't yet believe the revolution would reach this deep. You can hear the broom swish and the bucket clank. Or perhaps because he simply had a job to finish. He swept the Gallery des Glaces as the hall of mirrors. His reflection, distorted and silent, followed him across its floor. He emptied bins, lined with discarded ribbons and wilted invitations. In July 1789, as the Bastille fell, he lit the fireplace in the Dauphin's study. He was not a revolutionary, but he was still there. At night, the palace creaked in strange ways. But in the pantry, near the servant halls, he left bread out to dry. He boiled potatoes. He tucked his broom near and every morning, he began again, cleaning the grandeur of a world quietly falling apart. Let's pause here, in the cold marble corridor, and ask, when history crumbles in public, who cleans it up in private? Let's walk further into those empty, echoing chambers. It is now autumn, 1789. The court is unraveling. Supplies grow thin. Hallways once bustling with wigs and whispers, now stretch silent, interrupted only by the faint click of a mop pail wheel, and the distant sound of shouts from Paris. A maintenance note from October of that year, signed only by M. It mentions a broken hearth grate in the Queen's dressing chamber, and the need for more lamp oil in the lower servants' quarters. But here at Versailles, the janitor carries on. One record survives brief, easily overlooked, dusting the gilt moldings, while nobles whispered about bread riots, clearing away dead roses while couriers delivered warnings to the king. Historians suspect M.H. may have been this janitor. If so, that scribble is his only signature in the revolution. And yet, he moved through its center. He knew before anyone else that the palace was shrinking not in size, but in spirit. We can imagine his routines. He witnessed fear in the eyes of guards. He saw which rooms were no longer entered, which beds remained cold. He changed linens in rooms left untouched. He sealed off a leaking corridor near the Dauphine's music room with cloth, wax, and a small handwritten warning. Mind the step. Revolution, for him, wasn't a speech or a banner. Rooms ransacked. Blood was spilled on the marble. It was a change in dust patterns. Whether he cheered or wept, whether he feared for his life, he cleaned the chapel. When no one came to pray, no one read it. And then, in October, came the march. He tied back velvet curtains to let in morning light no one looked at. Thousands of women from Paris stormed Versailles, demanding food and the king. The palace was breached. Windows were broken. And still, he returned the next day. He mopped. No records tell us what he thought. But we know this. When the royal family was forced to leave Versailles and they were taken to Paris, the janitor stayed behind. The palace, suddenly hollow, fell into stillness. Not silence, though not with his footsteps echoing through the salons. 4 months after, he maintained what little remained. He boiled water in the kitchen that no longer cooked. He dusted portraits of monarchs. Already, maybe he hoped it would return. Maybe he didn't know what else to do. Maybe habit was all that remained. Let's pause here. By the Queen's staircase. The sun is dim through clouded windows. The marble is cold. The mop rests at the base of the steps. And we ask, when greatness departs a place, is the one who cleans up what's left the final witness? The Palace of Versailles did not burn. It did not collapse in battle. It faded, and the janitor remained. It had been emptied of its court, its musicians, its feasts. Furniture was sold, portraits removed, chandeliers dismantled. By the early 1790s, Versailles was no longer a royal residence. And still, a small staff stayed behind. A handful of keepers, a single cook, and one man who swept. We don't know what he thought of the revolution, but we know what he did. He waxed the parquet floors. He oiled the hinges of doors that no longer opened. He trimmed the candle wicks in case visitors returned. And when they didn't, he still lit them anyway. There is one entry in the Versailles maintenance ledger from 1791, almost 2 years after the royal family's departure. It reads, lower salon swept, smell of damp still present. West corridor cleaned. The revolution grew bloodier. Versailles was abandoned to the state. Its art auctioned. Its rooms some were turned into offices. Others simply rotted. No name on any execution list. No obituary. It is unsigned. But someone wrote it. Someone still cared that the salon was swept even if no one would ever use it again. Eventually, even that ended. And the janitor, he disappears. No record of departure. He left the palace as he lived in its inner margins, but his presence is everywhere. In the rooms that did not collapse, in the tapestries still hung, in the clean edges of a history too large to hold tidy. We often remember kings, queens, and revolutions, but not the ones who polished the throne, not the ones who scrubbed the walls while history cracked them, not the ones who, when everyone else left, stayed. There's a poem by an unknown author, the hound scribbled inside the hollow of a Versailles pantry wall. No crown, no court, no music now. Just footsteps in the dust. I clean, I patch, I sweep somehow, till even silence rusts. Perhaps he wrote it, or perhaps someone else, like him. Someone who served a world that no longer existed. So as we leave the palace quiet crumbling, still grand, we take one last look back and wonder, when no one's left to witness a revolution, is the janitor its final historian?